Karl Dönitz, Hitler's ruthless naval commander.
He was the mastermind.
His U-boats claimed thousands of lives.
There must have been few things more frightening than being hunted by one of these things.
He was a fanatical Nazi who would do anything.
What were conditions like for the slave laborers that were forced to build this bunker?
To see Hitler's evil dream fulfilled.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor?
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis. This is Hitler's Most Wanted. In many ways, I feel that Dönitz is the physical embodiment of the classic question, when and how someone who's in the armed forces becomes a war criminal. Guy, how do we decide when that line is actually being crossed?
The answer is very straightforward. You break the rules of war. Of course, it often sounds silly that there should be, rules for warfare. But no, there are rules. The big question we have to ask about Dönitz is whether he actually broke these rules of war.
Matt, I think this calls out for a question here, that if you're in the armed forces, killing is an integral part of your business. How does that affect your morality?
To some extent, I think this is a larger question, beyond just the war criminals we're talking about. The question is, how does morality change in times of war? How does warfare alter one's morality?
Anthony, why do so many people who are in the know about Dönitz's actions during the Second World War still try to present him as just a sailor following orders?
The idea of the clean military has long been a powerful myth, and it's easy to understand why. People want to say that, sure, the regime was criminal, it launched wars of aggression, but the soldiers and the sailors who served were honorable. In the case of the German military in World War II, this is largely a myth, and it's a myth that Dönitz's reputation has benefited from. He also shaped his legacy and his reputation to benefit from that myth.
Based on that, how do you value Dönitz's actions?
I think you have to go to Germany and see the way his legacy is presented and contested.
I'm on my way to Munich, to the Deutsches Museum, one of the world's biggest collections of historical technology. It's home to some unique artifacts that are the perfect starting point for my investigation.
Carla, hi.
Hi.
So this is it?
Yeah.
Carola Dolka is the curator of computer sciences and cryptology here.
There it is.
Yeah, that's the Enigma. The naval Enigma.
It's an Enigma machine, the infamous Nazi encoding device for sending top-secret messages.
Wow. So I've never got this close to one of these things before.
The Nazis used enigmas like this one to radio coded orders to their U-boats in the Atlantic and coordinate their attacks on Allied ships.
So how did the Navy and the U-boats use this machine to communicate with each other?
The one who uses the Enigma always has to type the message to encrypt it or decrypt it. So when you type an X, maybe you get a T. But when you type the X again, it will not be a T again, but maybe an F or something else.
During the Atlantic War, the German commander in charge of issuing those orders was Admiral Karl Dönitz.
Dönitz was a German naval officer. He was the driving force behind building up the German U-boat fleet.
Dönitz masterminded Nazi Germany's submarine warfare. It was he who realized quite how effective submarines would be in essentially blockading Britain and starving her of vital supplies from Canada and the United States.
Dönitz survived the war and was arrested by the Allies, who put him on trial alongside 21 other prominent Nazis at Nuremberg. He was indicted on 3 counts, including multiple conspiracy charges, waging a war of aggression, and committing crimes against the internationally recognized laws of war.
I'll give you one more opportunity of answering my question.
Ja, das weiß ich nicht.
Dönitz was absolutely defiant at Nuremberg. He thought that he was simply a senior armed forces officer who had just been doing his job. He was just a sailor.
he's not very well known among the general public. When people have heard of Dönitz, there's a tendency to think of him as an apolitical career military man rather than somebody involved in war crimes.
But if he really was just an officer following orders as he claimed, then why was he tried as a war criminal alongside top Nazis like Hermann Goering? Who exactly was Hitler's Star Admiral? My search for an answer begins with this. It's a U-1 submarine, the German Navy's very first model, and the standard training vessel when a young Karl Dönitz joined the U-boat corps during the First World War. So this is obviously the engine room. These things are definitely not built for people my height. Just imagine how hot it would have been. So claustrophobic and loud too.
You have to remember that U-boats and submarines were a relatively new form of warfare. You were hiding under the waves, popping up, destroying things, and then slipping away into the deeps and the darkness.
This is the torpedo room, the business end of the U-boat.
During World War I, Dönitz became convinced that the submarine was essential to future naval battles. He wasn't as interested in surface ships as he was in submarines, and he began thinking about how to build up Germany's submarine fleet.
Dönitz's U-boat was sunk by the Allies in the Mediterranean in 1918. He survived and saw the end of the war in a British POW camp. Dönitz spent a year there, fuming over Germany's defeat and drawing up new submarine tactics to beat the Allies if the chance ever came again.
He's preparing for wars and battles that he wants to fight. He wants to get in amongst the thick of it again, and he wants to give the Allies a real hammering.
Dönitz was dreaming of the day Germany's U-boat corps would return and redeem itself in battle. This is the Laber Naval Memorial, just outside the city of Kiel on Germany's north coast. Wow. Amazed at the size of this thing.
It's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, it rises up to 85 meters above sea level.
Dr. Jan Witt is a historian and a leading authority on Dönitz and German naval history. Now, my understanding is Dönitz's experience as a U-boat commander during the First World War made him a committed submariner. He saw the submarines as the future of naval warfare.
He was a true believer in this, yes, of course. The problem was that, according to the Versailles Treaty, Germany was forbidden to have any U-boats.
But in early 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. Like Dönitz, he too was a veteran of the First World War, bitter about the terms of Germany's surrender. He immediately set out to rebuild Germany's military, and in 1935, U-boats were reintroduced to the Navy. So Dönitz now finds himself in the German Navy as part of Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Now, obviously he's in the armed forces.
Yes.
But to what extent is he actually a committed Nazi?
Well, you have to understand the mindset of the German naval officers at that point of time. By far, most of them welcomed the Nazi regime, especially because this opened new hopes for re-strengthening the German armed forces. And
right.
Of course, also new career opportunities.
So they hoped that the Nazi regime would make the German armed forces great again.
Yes.
Dönitz became a committed Nazi and a rabid admirer of Adolf Hitler. He also embraced Hitler's trademark anti-Semitism.
He periodically made anti-Semitic speeches and made comments along the lines of, can you imagine what Germany would look like today without Hitler? There'd be Jews here, everything would be horrible. He said he'd rather die than live in a country that still had a Jewish presence.
And he was one of the most loyal follower of Hitler until the very end.
Dönitz was a rising star in the U-boat corps. He began training a new generation of submariners, demanding not only total devotion to duty, but to Hitler and Nazism as well.
And so he could build up again a German U-boat force and train his U-boatmen according to his new tactical ideas. And this is how he led or he led his U-boat warfare.
In September 1939, Hitler once again plunged the world into war. Karl Dönitz's shot at revenge had finally arrived, and his U-boats were about to wreak havoc on the Allies.
I can almost imagine what it would be like to sort of spot a convoy and then sending out a message to move in for the kill.
I'm on a mission to determine where Nazi submarine commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. Right now, I'm on Germany's north coast with Dr. Jan Witt, investigating Dönitz's actions during the Second World War.
Wow. So that's a real Type 7 U-boat.
Exactly, the last surviving in the world.
Amazing. Can we take a closer look?
Yes, of course.
Fabulous.
Mind your head.
I would definitely be too tall for a U-boat crewman. How many men traditionally served on this type of U-boat?
Up to 50 men.
50 men?
50.
So you had 50 men
Crammed inside this tube.
That's unbelievable. Oh my God, I can't imagine 50 men fitting in here.
2 toilets for 50 men.
2 toilets?
2 toilets. No showers, and the aft toilet was usually used as a provision store. So it was basically 1 toilet for 50 men.
So, I mean, it must have smelt disgusting in here.
Yes.
Wow.
U-boat crews endured these cramped conditions for months at a time as they prowled the North Atlantic.
So this is the radio room?
Exactly, as you can hear
Yes.
from the wireless Morse code. So there you find all the different types of radio, but also the Enigma.
Oh wow, so the Enigma machine would have been in here.
Exactly.
It's here that U-boats received Admiral Dönitz's orders of attack during the all-important Battle of the Atlantic.
The shadow of the conquering German armies covered Western Europe.
In June 1940, Hitler drove the Allies across the English Channel. Britain was now isolated, and Dönitz saw his chance to knock the nation out of the war.
The Atlantic is absolutely essential for getting vital supplies from Canada and the United States across to Great Britain. These are absolutely essential lifelines for Britain to stay in the war.
And one of the things that made U-boats so effective in the Second World War was the Wolfpack tactic. Now, that was something that Karl Dönitz came up with. Can you explain that to me?
It stems from the experience of the First World War. Dönitz started to think about different means of attack, new tactics, and so he came up with the idea not to have the U-boats attacking convoys individually, but in groups.
August 8, 1940, the German war machine opened the Battle of Britain with an all-out assault on coastal shipping, on the convoys that were keeping beleaguered England alive.
So part of the U-boats simply keep the escorts busy, while the other U-boats attack the actual convoy ships, the merchant vessels, and sink them. This was very, very effective, especially in the first stages of war, when the British had not enough escorts available.
By firing on unarmed merchant ships, Dönitz was engaging in a taboo tactic known as unrestricted submarine warfare.
Dutch tanker, British tanker. Again and again the torpedoes struck.
Unrestricted submarine warfare is essentially a tactic by which you are going to torpedo any ship that basically comes within your periscope. It doesn't matter whether you target a neutral merchant ship. If that's sailing across the Atlantic to give some supplies to the United Kingdom, then that's a valid target. That's a crime. Winston Churchill famously observed that actually, if the Allies had lost the battle at the Atlantic, they probably would have lost the Second World War.
Dönitz seemed willing to do anything to achieve victory, even if it meant killing unarmed civilians by the thousands.
Many believe that the perfect soldier may be somebody who has, say, loose moral codes. Certainly that type of individual might be very good at doing the dirty work, at being able to undertake the types of actions that would cause moral and ethical repercussions for other individuals.
There must have been few things more frightening in the Second World War than being hunted by one of these things.
I think so, yes. Imagine yourself standing on a merchant vessel in a dark night and a stormy night, and your vessel gets torpedoed. You go down and you have to go to a raft or into a lifeboat. And, well, I think the first thing is you're done for. That's it, the end of your life.
Dönitz's U-boats continued to wreak havoc on Allied supply convoys into early 1941. But their dominance was about to end.
There are essentially three ways in which the tide turns against Dönitz and his U-boat campaign. First of all, the Allies managed to crack the Enigma code. So we're starting to have a good idea of where these U-boat packs are because we're intercepting their signals. Secondly, there's another massive technological advance called ASDIC, in which you can start actually pinpointing the U-boats under the water with a form of radar and then just drop depth charges on them and just blow them up. And the third thing, of course, is the US then enters the war, and with it, greater naval power. That's another big threat to Dönitz.
The longer the war went, the better the defenses became, and the more refined that the anti-U-boat tactics became, and new weapons were introduced. The role of these U-boats more and more changed from being the hunters to being the hunted.
Right. The results were devastating for Dönitz's U-boat corps.
The casualty rates amongst U-boat crews is enormous. It's 75%. I mean, that is bigger than any other type of unit in the Second World War.
But that didn't stop Dönitz demanding construction of more U-boats and sending crew after crew into what was becoming a slaughter.
I can't think of a much more unpleasant death than being on the receiving end of an Allied depth charge attack when I'm in a U-boat. You must have felt entombed and helpless, knowing at any time that hull could crack and the North Atlantic could just pour into your U-boat and you're going to be drowned with all your mates. It must have been horrific.
Karl Dönitz's ruthlessness on the high seas is well documented. But he committed a host of other atrocities that are far less known.
Passiert. Und selbst nach der Kapitulation hat es noch solche Hinrichtungen gegeben.
I'm on a mission to find out where Nazi submarine commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. So far, I've seen how he embraced Nazism and unleashed his U-boat wolf packs in an attempt to starve Britain. Now I've come to Hamburg to investigate another side of Dönitz's cruelty. Where are you taking me?
James, ich führe...
René Sinenko is a historian and an expert in Nazi recruiting during the Second World War.
Das ist das sogenannte Deserteursdenkmal. Also der Gedenkort für die Deserteure der Wehrmacht und andere Opfer der NS-Militärjustiz. Das ist der offizielle Titel, James, yes? You must read from the opposite side.
So we have to go inside to read the text here?
Yes.
Okay, let's go inside then.
As long as there has been war, there have been deserters. There have been people who literally desert their post, flee, and refuse to continue to fight in the war that they're supposed to fight in. What makes desertion stand out in the case of Nazi Germany is the fact that desertion takes on a much clearer moral character when it's a matter of refusing to participate in a war of aggression, in a war of genocide.
What would have happened if you were caught deserting from the German armed forces in the Second World War?
Deserteure im Zweiten Weltkrieg wurden bei der Fahnenflucht, wenn sie verhaftet worden sind, vor ein Kriegsgericht gestellt und verurteilt. Wenn sie Glück hatten, sind sie mit einigen Monaten Haft, Militärhaft davongekommen, aber viele, viele Tausend von ihnen sind zum Tode verurteilt worden. Auch hier in Hamburg. Wir haben insgesamt 226 Namen von Soldaten, die hier in Hamburg am Höldigbaum, Schießplatz Höldigbaum, hingerichtet worden sind. Aber wahrscheinlich waren es wesentlich mehr.
How did Karl Dönitz view and treat deserters?
Ja, du weißt ja, dass Dönitz war der Nachfolger von Hitler, nachdem Hitler Selbstmord-Suizid begangen hat. Er war oberster Befehlshaber der Wehrmacht, nicht nur der Marine, sondern auch der Wehrmacht. Und hat noch in den letzten Kriegstagen viele Deserteure oder viele Fahnenflüchtige, die zum Tode verurteilt worden sind, musste er als oberster Kriegsherr das Todesurteil bestätigen. Das heißt, es sind noch eine Anzahl von Deserteuren wegen Dönitz seiner Bestätigung hingerichtet worden.
Hitler had issued guidelines for the punishment of desertion, and these guidelines saw some mitigating circumstances. If you deserted out of youthful foolishness, there were ways that you could escape the death penalty. But for Dönitz, this wasn't true at all, and he issued a competing ordinance that called for the death penalty in every case of desertion.
Obwohl der Krieg schon fast zu Ende war und in einigen Fällen war die Kapitulation schon passiert, und selbst nach der Kapitulation hat es noch solche Hinrichtungen gegeben. Dönitz war also ein Scharfmacher, ein Durchhaltegeneral, der unbedingt wollte, dass der Krieg in den Gleisen, so wie Adolf Hitler das befohlen hat, zu Ende geführt wird. Oder das heißt, auch Dönitz selbst hat aus dem Krieg nichts gelernt. Und deshalb sehe ich Dönitz natürlich als Kriegsverbrecher, der er war, sehr, sehr kritisch.
But back in 1946, the question of whether Dönitz was a criminal in the eyes of the law had yet to be resolved. That was the job of the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials. During the proceedings, the prosecution confronted Dönitz with a damning piece of evidence about Nazi treatment of Allied commandos caught behind German lines.
It's Dönitz who's enforcing Hitler's commando order, which stipulates that any commandos caught should be summarily shot, executed right there and then. This is a flagrant breach of the rules of war.
I asked you yesterday about the secrecy standard of the original Führer order that the shooting of uniformed prisoners acting on military orders must be carried out even after they have surrendered voluntarily and asked for pardon.
Most sides accept the fact that if you aren't wearing your uniform and you're spying, then basically you deserve to be executed. But commandos? No, commandos are special troops, but they're still just regular troops in uniforms fighting, under the rules of war. Hitler doesn't like them, Dönitz doesn't like them, and he's happy to help them get executed.
Do you agree that that is a reason for giving top secrecy to this document?
Ja, das weiß ich nicht. Das kann ich nicht sagen, weil ich diesen Kommandobefehl nicht herausgegeben habe.
I'll give you one more opportunity of answering my question. Will you answer it or won't you?
Ja, das will ich tun. Ich halte das für möglich, zumal der Jurist hier dieser Ansicht ist. Ob das stimmt, weiß ich nicht, weil ich den Befehl nicht herausgegeben habe.
Dönitz has got problems when it comes to defending himself, because it's Dönitz who's behind enforcing Hitler's commando order.
We hear a lot about the fact that they were just following orders. That also happens to be one of the primary ways in which you can use justification to try to reduce the cognitive dissonance that you may be experiencing inside. There is some evidence there that they do have some recognition that what they were doing was in fact wrong, or else they wouldn't need the justification in the first place.
But the prosecution wasn't finished with Dönitz yet. They had even more shocking evidence for the court. They accused him of using slaves.
12,000 concentration camp prisoners will be employed in the shipyards as additional labor. Now that is your document. May we take it that you were familiar with the fact of the existence of concentration camps?
Das habe ich auch nie geleugnet.
I have never denied it.
And do we have any idea how many forced laborers lost their lives building this thing?
I think about 1,600 victims.
My mission to determine where Nazi naval commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil has brought me to the German town of Reich, near the North Sea coast, home to this massive concrete bunker called the Valentin submarine pens.
What part of the bunker are we in here?
We are now at the end of the whole production line. This place was meant to produce submarines on a kind of assembly line. And the last
Dr. Markus Meyer is a historian and an expert in Nazi naval history.
This place is absolutely ginormous. I'm still trying to get my head around how big it is. Why did they build this?
They wanted to build submarines, and they needed a kind of place that was protected from Allied airstrikes. And so they decided to build this huge construction, which should have been bomb-proof, against the biggest bombs they had at that time.
By early 1943, the tide of war had turned against the Nazis. Allied bombers were attacking German industrial centers day and night, threatening to shut down arms production. Hitler was looking for anything that could help him strike back. Karl Dönitz was convinced he had the answer, in the form of the powerful new Type 21 submarine.
The Type 21 was an attempt to try and take out as many Allied vessels as possible.
Exactly. Dönitz was responsible for this project. This was the most important project of the German Navy at that time. And Dönitz was convinced that the Type 21 would win the war, basically, and to sink more ship space than the Allies could rebuild.
But to build the Type 21s, he needed a factory safe from the relentless Allied air raids. Dönitz needed a place like this.
How big actually is this structure?
About 419 meters long. It covers a ground about 5 soccer grounds. We have walls at the moment at about 4.60 meters, and the roof would have been brought to 7 meters.
So the walls are 4.5 meters thick?
Exactly, and that should have been thick enough to protect the whole production process against airstrikes.
Building a structure on this scale called for a massive labor force. But the vast majority of German men were needed for the war effort. So the Nazis found another way.
The key thing about the Valentin bunker is that it was constructed using massive numbers of slave laborers.
They were concentration camp prisoners, mainly Soviets and Poles, along with Italian POWs and French conscripts, all shipped to Wrexham and forced at gunpoint to build the Valentin submarine pen.
12,000 concentration camp prisoners will be employed in the shipyards as additional labor. Now that is your document.
Dönitz used slaves. I think it's a real measure of Dönitz's brutality and, frankly, evil that he's requesting 12,000 slaves.
What were conditions like for the slave laborers that were forced to build this bunker?
Very bad. They had nearly nothing to eat. The average weight of a prisoner at that time was about 45 kilograms. So say they suffered from having nothing to eat and nothing to drink. They had to do very hard work, carrying sacks of cement about 50 kilograms, so more than their own weight. They were forced to work very quickly. They were heavily guarded. There was nearly no possibility to take a break, just a short break. So it was working nearly 12 hours a day. And after that, you had the life in the camps, also guarded, also bad conditions when it comes to what beds you get and what kind of hygiene standards you have. There were nearly no standards for hygiene.
And do we have any idea how many forced laborers lost their lives building this thing?
We are talking about 1,600 victims during the 2 years.
If they had managed to finish this bunker and the facilities inside it, would that have changed anything?
From, I think, autumn 42 on, that was impossible. The Germans could have built boat after boat after boat, but the Americans and the Canadians were faster. So the idea to sink more ship space than the Allies could rebuild was a fantasy.
Everything about Dönitz's actions towards the end of the war shows that he was a much more fanatical Nazi than was previously suspected. He was fighting to the bitter end.
But before that end, Karl Dönitz would receive a shocking and totally unexpected promotion.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor?
I'm on a journey to find out where Nazi naval commander Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. On May 1st, 1945, millions of war-weary Germans tuned in to hear an unfamiliar voice deliver some momentous news.
Unser Führer Adolf Hitler ist gefallen. Der Führer hat mich zu seinem Nachfolger bestimmt.
He was Hitler's hand-picked successor as head of state, not as Führer, but as Reichspräsident, or president of the Reich.
It's quite a surprising choice. You would have thought that someone like Himmler or Goering or some of these other far more sort of kind of big Nazi political names would have taken that job.
I've come to the northern port city of Flensburg to find out more about Dönitz's brief tenure as president in the final days of Nazi Germany.
Dr. Pust? James, very nice to meet you.
Dieter Pust.
Dr. Dieter Pust is a historian, author, and a leading authority on the city's history.
Nice to see you in Flensburg.
The city is the longtime home of the German Naval Academy, and it's where Dönitz chose to make his final stand as the only man apart from Hitler to lead the Third Reich.
Why did Hitler choose Dönitz as his successor rather than Himmler, Goering, or a number of other prominent Nazi leaders?
Because Dönitz has been the truest follower of Hitler. He has not connection to politics.
So the other members of the leadership had discredited themselves in Hitler's eyes.
Yes.
So Dönitz was the natural successor for Hitler because he was someone who had not betrayed Hitler.
Dönitz has always been loyal, Dönitz has always been true. There's none of the politicking nonsense about Dönitz. He wasn't that kind of political figure, you know, always part of the center of the Nazi soap opera.
When Dönitz announced Hitler's death to the German people, he stated that Hitler had died fighting at the head of his troops in Berlin. He didn't reveal the fact that Hitler had committed suicide. Why was that?
Es war, den Mythos über Hitler aufrechtzuerhalten. Auch in Bezug auf die Soldaten und jeden Deutschen, der seine Pflicht erfüllen müsste bis zum Letzten. Und den Mythos aufrechtzuerhalten, dass Hitler also nach seinen eigenen Grundsätzen dann sozusagen bis zum Ende für das deutsche Volk sich aufgeopfert hat. Und das war, wie gesagt, die letzte große Lüge des NS-Systems.
Dönitz was unfailingly loyal. In Hitler's political testament, when he entrusts Dönitz with the position of president of the Reich, he says that Dönitz should carry out the military struggle using all means available.
By this time, Berlin was in ruins, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a few scattered pockets of resistance. Their war was utterly lost. Nonetheless, Dönitz ordered German troops facing the Soviets to stand and fight.
So where are you taking me now?
Ja, wir sind auf dem Weg zu einer besonderen Station hier in Flensburg. Und zwar dem Ort, an dem Dönitz zuletzt hier in der Stadt gewesen ist.
All right, let's go in.
In front of us is the building, where for a few fleeting weeks in May 1945, Karl Dönitz ran the final Nazi government.
The Flensburg government took up offices at the Naval Academy, and it actually had some of its ministries on ships in the water surrounding the Naval Academy. This was a very strange 21 days in German history.
Stranger still was Dönitz's plan to save the crumbling Reich.
It's a measure of how actually detached the Nazi leadership, and in particular Dönitz, was from the realities of the situation, that he calls upon the Western allies to team up with the remnants of the Nazi forces to actually prosecute a war against the Soviet Union.
Hat zunächst versucht, Waffenstillstandsverhandlungen zu führen mit den Westmächten, mit dem Argument, in Zukunft würde der Feind aller der Sowjetkommunismus sein im Osten. Und darauf sind aber die Alliierten nicht eingegangen.
So the Allies were going to keep fighting Germany until they committed to an agreement of unconditional surrender.
From Allied headquarters aboard the Patria at Flensburg, North Germany,
orders go out for the arrest of the last top Nazi.
Having run out of options, Dönitz announced Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7th, 1945. The war in Europe was over.
Now the Führer of the beaten Third Reich, Grand Admiral Dönitz himself, comes out under Allied arrest. He walks through a tunnel in the Flensburg compound to imprisonment.
Und von hier aus erfolgte dann die Überführung der prominenten Gefangenen zum Flugplatz Schäferhaus. Und von dort erfolgte dann die Überführung zunächst nach Niedersachsen und dann schließlich nach Nürnberg zum Nürnberger Prozess.
So you're telling me that after Dönitz was arrested, he would have stood right where I'm standing here?
Ja.
Wow.
Hat sich dann noch beschwert, dass nicht richtig als Militär in Uniform und so weiter zur Kenntnis genommen wurde von den Alliierten, die ihn dann abgeführt haben.
And he stood here when it had all ended for him, that he had been arrested, his time as the leader of Germany was over, and after this moment, it was really just a short while before he was going to stand trial at Nuremberg.
Dönitz est inculpé des crimes faits par les premiers, deuxième et troisième chefs de l'acte d'accusation.
On October 15th, 1946, after nearly a year of testimony, the Nuremberg verdicts were read, and Karl Dönitz learned his fate.
Dönitz was indicted on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, waging a war of aggression, and crimes against the laws of war. He was found not guilty on the first count, but convicted on the second 2.
Dönitz was found guilty of committing heinous war crimes, but while many of his fellow Nazis were sentenced to hang, he received just 10 years imprisonment.
I think Dönitz's sentence was far too short. I think he got lucky because he had a decent lawyer. And what's very difficult when you're prosecuting a man like Dönitz is that if you start accusing him of waging unrestricted submarine warfare, then you better be sure that your own side hasn't done the same thing. And Dönitz's lawyer had actually got an affidavit from the US naval commander Nimitz to say that he too had engaged in a similar type of warfare. And this is what Dönitz can rely upon for his defense. He's going to say, yeah, maybe I did something bad. But so did you, so why are you prosecuting just me?
Standing here with Dieter on the very spot where Dönitz was taken into custody, I'm left with one last question.
After the war, did Dönitz ever express regret or remorse for the crimes he committed?
He said he has only so gewesen, dass danach die Pflicht erfüllt hat und insofern sich keinen Grund gesehen hat, sich da zu entschuldigen oder.
Karl Dönitz was released in 1956, the first of the major Nazis serving time to be set free. He died in 1980 at age 89. Now it's time to find out where Dönitz ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
He is up to his neck in crimes against humanity.
My journey has given me new insight into Karl Dönitz's fanatical belief in Hitler and Nazism, and revealed the truth about his use of slave labor in a pointless attempt to prolong the war. It's also demonstrated his complete lack of any remorse. Now it's time for us to decide where he should sit in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Karl Dönitz ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted. At Nuremberg, Dönitz is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Do you think that's fair for his actions during the Second World War?
No, I think it's pitiful. There were submarines operating with utmost ruthlessness against merchant shipping. Many innocent men, women and children were sent to their deaths by Dönitz's men on his orders. So, as far as I'm concerned, he is up to his neck in crimes against humanity.
The place that I went to that had the biggest impact on me was the Valentin U-boat bunker. This was a structure that was built under Dönitz's orders by slave labor, and construction started at a time when the war was already unwinnable for Nazi Germany.
What the building of that bunker shows is that you really can't separate the military and what it did from the human rights violations and other atrocities of the Nazi state. It's a U-boat bunker. It's built with slave labor. Dönitz has unclean hands in the crimes of the Third Reich, and you see it in the building of that bunker.
One of the advantages Dönitz has as a sailor is that the Third Reich's Navy, of course, is not directly involved in the Holocaust in the same way as the Army and the SS and all these other apparatuses of the Nazi state. And it's that distance, or perceived distance, that makes Dönitz look a little bit cleaner than other Nazis.
Matt, given Dönitz's actions during the Battle of the Atlantic and his willing use of slave labor, what does that say about his morality?
Well, the average soldier's sense of morality is going to shift to some extent in times of war. There's no question about that. And yet, Dönitz's actions do seem to go far beyond what would be considered to be a normal shift in morality. His behaviors are certainly immoral.
And that relatively light sentence had a detrimental effect on the process of reckoning in post-war Germany, because it allowed Dönitz to retire and to write his memoirs and to peddle his narrative of who he was and what he did.
Well, that seems to be evidence of a denial of responsibility. And that is a feature of some individuals who have committed atrocious crimes. In fact, they'll often see themselves as the victim for having been locked up.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the problems that Nuremberg had is that there were some Allied commanders who had committed probably very similar crimes to those committed by Dönitz, and that's why the tribunal went a little bit more easily on him than it actually should have done.
So what I'd like to do now is come to a conclusion as to where you think Dönitz ranks in the hierarchy of evil. Anthony, what are your thoughts?
Being an admiral and being Hitler's successor as head of state aren't things to dismiss. At the same time, I don't think Dönitz was anywhere near as central to the atrocities committed by the Nazi state as some of the other people we've discussed here. So I rank him number 26.
Guy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Dönitz, in a normal war, quote-unquote, and if he had worked for a normal regime, quote-unquote, and done the actions he had done, would be a major war criminal. I'll put him straight into the top 10. But there are so many other players in the Nazi pantheon who are a lot worse than him. So I'm going to go about 24.
Okay. And Matt?
I'm going to largely agree with my historian colleagues here. I would rank him at 25.
So it's interesting, the three of you basically have come to an almost unanimous conclusion about where he should rank in the mid-20s. Matt, I have to agree with you. I think 25 is where he should be ranked. He's therefore the 8 of spades. Karl Dönitz was a fanatical Nazi whose tactics and orders claimed thousands of innocent lives. As Hitler's successor, he tried to prolong the war. For that, he ranks 25th among Hitler's most wanted. Hans Frank, Hitler's conniving personal lawyer.
He saw the law as a means to power.
He twisted the legal system to sanction the Führer's crimes and enslaved a nation.
I despise him.
Under his tyrannical rule, millions of Polish Jews were sent to the gas chamber.
Every Jew was a target for extermination.
What turned a cultured lawyer into the monster known as the Butcher of Poland.
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis.
This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Why is Hitler's lawyer someone we should even care about?
If we were in Poland, Hans Frank would be an obvious choice to talk about. He was responsible for so many atrocities, so much suffering.
What I particularly find fascinating about Frank is that, he is a middle-class professional. He's a lawyer, and this is a classic example of how the trappings of kind of bourgeois respectability can be so easily subverted and used to promote something incredibly vile.
And history is filled with strong, smart, intelligent individuals who have ended up on the wrong side of morality.
Frank is absolutely pivotal. He has this massive role, he exterminates a lot of people, and he is right at the heart of the Third Reich.
Despite all of that, why do the majority of people still not know who he is? To answer the question, I've come to Germany, to the small town of Ecklach, northwest of Hamburg.
So Nicholas, tell me, what do we have here?
Some pictures. This first one is Hitler before he took over power in Germany. My father was his personal liar between, I would say, 28 and 33 of the last century.
Author and journalist Nicholas Frank is the youngest of Hans Frank's 5 children. He's the only one among them to have denounced their father.
And here you can see little Nicholas.
And this kid is you?
Yeah, that kid is me.
How old are you here?
2 years.
2 years old.
Yes. I hated this close.
Hans Frank was appointed Governor General of Poland when the country fell to the Germans in 1939. Nicholas spent his first years as a witness to his father's rule over the occupied territory.
And here's the King of Poland, my father, on the tower of the WWII castle. And this I hate especially, this picture.
Why?
Yes, because at this direction was the ghetto, at this direction was concentration camp, down in the streets, everywhere, the SS guards, and he was pretending here to be a peaceful, far-looking statesman. He knew exactly what he really was, the governor on a sea of blood. Ah!
Before his death, Hans Frank wrote a note to each of his children inside a small book of prayers.
And here's the inscription. It was written on the 18th of September 1946.
And what does the message roughly say?
In most heartful love, he gives me this small prayer book, and he wishes me a very good life under the merciful guard of God.
And how do you feel when you read it now?
This is all lies. This is all lies. Why didn't he write, my dear beloved Nicky? I was a criminal. I am sure that I will get the death penalty. And it's right. Please have a little bit more civil courage, which I never had. Please lead quite a different life. Yours, Fatih.
So you wish he'd admitted to his crimes and taken responsibility for his actions?
Klar.
I despise him.
How did Hans Frank become such a terrifying and hated figure? Not just to his own flesh and blood, but to a whole nation. To find out, I'm in Berlin, the city where Hans Frank first came to Hitler's attention.
You have to be a certain way to get attracted to a movement like the Nazis.
Yes.
What was it about the Nazi Party that attracted Hans Frank?
I mean, I think it's an excellent question in the sense that it's not an obvious home for a lawyer.
No.
The principle of National Socialism is precisely that people are not equal, and that what they say overrides the law.
Yeah. Dr. Henning Grunwald is an expert on legal history during the Weimar Republic. I want to understand how Hans Frank became a Nazi and rose through party ranks.
So, what was the environment in which he became a lawyer?
Well, it was the Weimar Republic, so a very politically fraught environment. And Frank, from his father, who was a failed lawyer, imbued him with attitudes that we would call quite clearly anti-Semitic.
Hans Frank was born into a professional middle-class family, a very patriotic family. His brother was killed in action in World War I. Hans Frank himself joined the military after high school, but never saw action before the armistice was signed.
At the end of the First World War, you've got young men looking for a purpose. In many ways, they're rootless. They've come back from war, or they've just missed out on the war, but there's no obvious job for them to fall into. And then, of course, you've got the Treaty of Versailles, negotiated by the Allies, very much against Germany, really making Germany pay for that war. And so when you've got a voice like Hitler's saying to the millions of young men like Hans Frank, I'm going to save this, I'm going to sort this out, it's not surprising that men like Frank can fall under his spell.
Hans Frank joined the early Nazi movement in Munich. But it wasn't until he started defending Nazi thugs, known as stormtroopers, that he came to the Führer's attention.
How does he become Hitler's lawyer?
Yeah. So, in 1928, he represented Hitler himself in the so-called Italian gold trials, which turned around allegations in the electoral campaign of 1928 that Hitler essentially was in Mussolini's pocket. Frank pleaded on Hitler's behalf, and then on the back of that, managed to persuade him to become his lawyer, to become the Nazi party lawyer.
Frank goes on to represent many Nazis in the courts, but his personal mission was to do much more than defend individual clients. He just needed an opportunity.
In late September 1930, Nazi officers are accused in the so-called Reichswehr trial. So this is about a group of 3 National Socialist officers who have formed a kind of, if you will, revolutionary cell.
3 junior military officers were charged with spreading Nazi doctrines, and Frank used that trial to dramatically defend them and to defend Nazism more broadly.
But it's Frank's star witness who steals the show.
Frank's real stroke of sort of genius there was to put Hitler and as a witness under oath.
Hitler knows that he can't just appeal to disaffected youth. No, what he also needs to do is to impress the bourgeoisie. And these are people who take the rule of law very seriously. They know that the rule of law gives stability. And if the Nazi Party can seem part of that stable structure, then it makes it appear far more acceptable, far more legitimate, and therefore far more likely for Hitler to get into power.
Hitler says, I sympathize with these officers in the dock. You know, they have the right ideas, but the wrong means. You know, we will seek power only by legal means.
The trial was a media sensation, and it became Frank's signature case. The accused are found guilty, but given lenient sentences. But for Hans Frank, the verdict was irrelevant.
There's a lot of newspaper coverage, inimical, friendly. It doesn't matter, because in this case, the exposure is everything. The trial really was crucial both for the Nazi Party and for the trajectory of Frank's career.
Frank's skillful manipulation of the courtroom led to a dramatic turn in both his and the Führer's fortunes. In the 1930 election, the Nazis took 18% of the popular vote and were now the second largest political party in Germany.
So Frank really plays a key role in legitimizing the Nazi Party to a large group of German society.
Yes, precisely.
By 1933, Hitler had risen to power in Germany. The Führer rewarded Frank for his loyalty with political appointments. But where he really made his mark is behind the scenes as the party's chief legal policymaker.
Es ist daher Aufgabe des Rechts, diese, das Charakteristische des deutschen Lebens ausmachende und die schöpferische Wurzel aller deutschen Tat gewährleistende Rassensubstanz des deutschen Volkes mit aller Macht aller Welt gegenüber zu schützen.
There are those who follow laws, and there are those who create and shape them. Individuals who follow laws tend to be moral, law-abiding citizens. Individuals that create and shape laws don't necessarily fall into that category. In fact, history is marred with evidence of individuals who have used their own power and their ability to create and shape laws to their own discretion, regardless of morality and ethics.
One of Frank's first acts was to target so-called enemies in his own profession.
It starts with the Jews that were evicted, quite literally, right, from the courthouses. You know, on the morning of 7th of April, the stormtroopers came and basically said, we will, you know, remove all Jewish lawyers.
The names of more than 600 of those professionals are listed here.
These people were driven out of the legal profession and ultimately murdered because they were Jews. Frank was central in driving them out and thereby facilitating their murder.
So this, to me, really exemplifies the contempt that Hans Frank and the Nazis had for the law.
Basically, he saw the law as a means to power.
But for Hans Frank, This was just the beginning.
The Jews in general are an object of Frank's policy who have to be destroyed.
My quest to find out where Hans Frank sits in the hierarchy of evil has brought me to the Polish city of Krakow, where Hitler's personal lawyer spent most of the war.
What I've come here to explore is this. What happened to turn a man with an exceptional legal mind into the monster known as the Butcher of Poland?
The Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, instigating the bloodiest military conflict in modern history. After the military victory, Hitler appointed Hans Frank Governor General of the occupied territory. In a gesture that would foreshadow his despotic rule, Hans Frank moved into Wawel Castle, the former royal residence of Polish kings.
It was right here that Hans Frank established himself as a pseudo-monarch, ruling over his Polish realm.
Frank's first order of business was to implement Nazi racist doctrine. At its core was the persecution of the Jews.
So is this part of the ghetto wall?
This is the left part of the ghetto wall, yes.
To learn how he accomplished this, I'm turning to historian Dr. Magnus Brackken. He's brought me to an infamous symbol of Nazi cruelty.
The plaque says to those who became the victims of Hitler and the occupation.
Well, should we have a look and see what it looks like on the other side, around here?
Okay.
So how personally involved was Hans Frank in the creation and the implementation of the Krakow ghetto?
When the war started and he was established here, Frank wanted to get his area as free of Jews as the rest of the Reich.
Hans Frank immediately began implementing anti-Semitic measures.
He starts very quickly enacting laws against the Jews, stripping them of all their rights and stripping them, frankly, of their dignity.
Across Poland, the Nazis closed synagogues and plundered Jewish homes. They mandated forced labor for any Jew over the age of 12. In 1940, Frank upped the ante, introducing a brutal new measure to segregate the Jewish population.
Ghettos are effectively prisons. There's no other word to describe them. There's a great big wall around it, there's a barbed wire around it, there are troops patrolling it. It's also another way of proving your utter superiority over another people. What do? You fence them in, you wall them in, you block them in.
So these buildings would have been inside the ghetto?
Inside the ghetto, yes.
So and people would have been crammed into these?
Yeah, and of course it's concentrated. You have the wall around it and you are not allowed to get out. And the conditions would be very rough because there is little options to have food and all the necessary everyday support in here.
The Nazis built hundreds of ghettos across Poland. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest. 400,000 people were confined to 3.4 kilometers of space.
You can imagine the overcrowding, the filth, the hunger, the deprivation. Add to that the Nazis were forcing Jews in the ghetto to participate in forced labor. They were farming them out, essentially, to German companies and factories.
Well, it looks like there's another part of the wall here.
Yeah, indeed.
What really hits home for me is there would have been children behind these walls.
It's a playground on the other side today, which is very strange contrast to imagine how it would have been there in 1941, 1942, 43.
In 2.5 years of the occupation, 83,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto alone died from disease and starvation.
People try to survive somehow, to get some food, to get a normal life, if we can call it normal at all. It was all covered by this permanent threat and all covered by the need to get something to eat, which is at the heart of everything. And if you get ill, it's of course more or less a death sentence.
Yeah, it's just horrifying. Every day it was just about trying to survive to the next day.
Exactly.
The tombstone shape of Krakow's ghetto walls was tragically prophetic.
The Nazis decided to build ghettos throughout Poland because they wanted to make it easier to round up the Jews when it came to slaughter them. You know where to get them when you want to deport them to the camps.
Across occupied Europe, Hitler's deputies implemented the final solution: the deliberate and systematic extermination of the Jews. Despite the grossly criminal directive, Hans Frank showed no objection to state-organized mass murder.
People often conflate intelligence and wisdom with morality. We assume that people who are intelligent enough to know better are going to fall on the right side of ethics and morality, but this isn't necessarily the case.
Addressing his senior officials in late 1941, Hans Frank insisted they show no mercy in carrying out the Führer's plan.
And then people were deported to the death camps, extermination camps, and most of them were killed there.
It's just so crazy for me just to think that people could have that thought process, to sit around and say, right, we're going to make this policy of our regime to do that.
The Jews in general are an object of the National Socialist policy, of Frank's policy, who have to be destroyed.
By the end of the war, after 5.5 years of brutal occupation, 3 million Jews, 90% of Poland's Jewish population, were murdered by the Nazis.
Hans Frank was rightly known and is rightly remembered as the Butcher of Poland. He ruled with an iron fist and in an incredibly cruel way. His mission was to exterminate the Jewish population of Poland. Every Jew was a target for extermination.
But Hans Frank doesn't stop with the genocide of Poland's Jews. He is determined to wipe an entire nation off the map.
For them, Polish people only being something like slaves.
I'm in Krakow, the center of Nazi occupation in Poland during the war, to investigate Hans Frank. He ruled the Nazi-held territory, and I'm here to learn about his role in the Führer's chilling plans for a conquered nation.
When was this museum founded?
The first exhibition in 1991.
Matus Gaulik is a historian at the Home Army Museum. He is an expert on Poland's resistance movement during the Second World War.
We have some letter paper. Hans Frank used it when he wrote, for example, orders to his officers, orders like shoot somebody and so on. And we have an original paper, letter paper. For example, you see Heil Hitler, Hans Frank is his signature.
As Poland's de facto ruler, Hans Frank was tasked with paving the way for the Führer's cold-blooded vision in the occupied territory.
Generalplan Ost, or General Plan East, was a big master plan drawn up by the Nazis and under, obviously, the stewardship of Hitler to basically conquer and subdue everything east of Berlin, all the way through to Moscow. You were going to treat all these lands as a kind of breadbasket for the German people. The existing people there, the Untermenschen, the subhumans, would be driven even further east, and then all that territory was then going to be lived in by Germanic settlers. Generalplan Ost basically called for a liquidation of millions of people, an occupation of millions of square miles of territory. It was absolutely barbaric.
Untermensch is a term in Nazi racial ideology. It essentially means subhuman, and it referred to the groups that the Nazis saw as racially inferior. Of course, the Jews are the most prominent example, but the Nazis also saw Slavs as racially inferior, as a population fit only for servitude and eventual displacement.
To enact the Führer's plan, Frank opened Poland's doors to Nazi death squads in September 1939. They started at the very top of Polish society.
I know that when the Germans occupied Poland, one of the first things they did is try to remove the sort of Polish elites.
Yes, exactly. First prisoners in the concentration camp in Auschwitz were teachers, priests, professors from the University of, for example, here from Krakow.
It seems to me as if the Germans were trying to turn Poland into a slave state.
Yeah, exactly. For them, Polish people only being something like slaves. They working in the concentration camp, in worker camp.
To the Germans, Poland was to become nothing more than a giant labor camp. What Hans Frank hadn't counted on, however, was the indomitable spirit of the Polish people.
This is an amazing collection of firearms.
Yeah, MG42, rifles like Mosin, Mausers, Panzerfaust, MG34, for example, Polish mortars, a lot of guns.
The Home Army Museum features a small arsenal, once used by those who dared to fight the Germans.
The Polish Home Army was essentially a semi-uniformed resistance to Hitler and the occupying Nazi forces. These were incredibly brave men and women, and what they were doing was trying to hamper as much of the German occupation as they could. Frank, of course, absolutely loathed them and wanted to destroy them.
The Home Army was a symbol for not only of our military resistance, but also is a symbol of freedom, that we cannot give up. Even in the 1939, everybody believed that we win this war. Maybe not this year, maybe next year, but we win. And when we resistance to Germans, then we have a hope.
So it was about fighting back and keeping the hope alive that one day Poland will be liberated from the Nazis.
Yes, because you see death in every day.
The Home Army counted nearly 400,000 members by 1944, but they were fighting with scraps. So obviously the MG42 is a German machine gun.
Yeah, German machine gun which Home Army captured from a train. And you see that nicknames of Polish soldiers. For example, Hardy, tough guy.
So the people who captured these engraved their nicknames on them?
They use it, and it's my weapon. I shoot it, and is a part of me. And I wrote my nickname.
Amazing.
One thing that stands out about Poland during World War II is that you had an effective and organized armed resistance to the Nazis. It was able to sabotage and slow down and foil some Nazi plans to impose their will on Poland.
The most well-known act of Polish resistance to the Germans is the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of 1944.
As the Allies advance towards Berlin, the Home Army feels incredibly empowered by the fact that the Red Army, Stalin's forces, are coming in from the east, and they're going to sweep, hopefully, into Warsaw and liberate it from the Nazis. And so, as Stalin approaches, the Home Army decides to rise up, fight street by street throughout Warsaw. What happens is appalling. Stalin and the Red Army stop, and he lets the rising fail. He wants the Germans to crush the Poles, and then he's then going to crush the Germans.
After 63 days of bitter fighting, the far better armed Wehrmacht defeated the uprising. So how did the Germans respond to attacks by the Polish Home Army?
I'll give you an example. When Polish resistance Home Army officer killed Polish actor who collaborate with Germans, they killed 150 people in Warsaw.
150 people?
Yes. Because Polish resistance killed one actor.
For one actor?
Yeah.
That's horrifying. The reprisals against those who dared to fight the Nazis were merciless. And even the very act of trying to stay alive could mean death.
Here we have just little piece of pork fat.
Yeah.
For that thing, I would go to Treblinka camp.
You would go to a death camp?
Yes.
For just having pork fat?
It was banned.
On my mission to figure out where Hans Frank sits in Hitler's hierarchy of evil, I've come to the home of author Aleksandra Zubrotko-Janika. She's written extensively on Polish women and daily life under the German occupation. Right, so I just ladle beans in here?
We have to process them to mousse.
I'm here to learn how Poles resisted Frank's brutal regime on the home front.
But be careful for your fingers.
I will. I'll try not to grind anything off. We're baking a cake with the same limited ingredients Poles had in the war, when food was strictly rationed by the Germans. And so they could grow the beans themselves, so it was very efficient to cook with beans.
Gardening was very popular because everyone tried to grow veggies to eat them. Starvation was a huge problem.
The Nazi policy of rationing food during the occupation of Poland was really a policy of starvation. It was a policy of genocide carried out through starvation, and it wasn't carried out equally.
Using a food rationing system, the Nazis set out to starve the Poles. Non-Jews were given just enough food to keep them in chains. The Jews got the very worst of it. Their allotment of food wouldn't keep them alive for long.
How many ingredients go into the cake?
Just 3.
Just 3 ingredients?
Yes.
Why so few?
During wartime, there was a real struggle to get some elaborate ingredients.
Life under Hans Frank became one long fight for survival. At harvest time, German troops went to the countryside to steal crops for export to Germany. Peasants were shot for not fulfilling their quota. The Poles turned to the black market to stay alive. They grew vegetables in secret or raised livestock in locations hidden from the Germans.
People have an innate instinct to survive. In life and death situations, people may be willing to do things that they wouldn't normally be comfortable doing, things that may go against their moral code.
So by making a cake like this, it's not only part of surviving, it's also part of resisting.
Exactly. Thanks to Polish women who really smuggling those banned produce, people can eat, people can resist. So we have to mix egg yolks with our sweetener.
Okay.
We have to put our beans into the mix.
So you're using the whole of the egg, you're using both the yolks and the whites.
Nothing could go to waste. Even breadcrumbs were used.
How am I looking?
Better.
Better?
Yeah.
Under Frank's repressive regime, Polish women risked their lives to feed their families.
And what would happen if they were caught with ingredients that were banned?
I show you. Here we have just a little piece of pork fat.
Yep.
For that thing, I would go to Treblinka camp.
You go to a death camp
Yes.
for just having pork fat.
It was banned. Pork fat or having unregistered porks,
Yeah.
that was a capital offense.
So it was a death sentence to be found with something like this in your possession?
Yes, there are many examples of people that were taken out of a train and killed next to train, just on the side.
Wow.
It was awful, it was scary, but Poles always find a way.
The only way that Poles could survive the harsh rationing imposed by Hans Frank was to rely on very creative strategies, usually devised by Polish women, to subvert and undercut the rationing system. This involved the black market, this involved smuggling. This was the only way for anyone to survive the forced starvation.
That looks great. Look at that.
It looks almost like sponge cake.
It does. I'd say I've never had white bean cake before. This is like... It's really good. I can't believe this is just 3 major ingredients.
Polish wartime cookery books are full of recipes like that.
Mm.
Yet despite the efforts to subvert Nazi-engineered famine, hundreds of thousands of Jews and non-Jewish Poles died from starvation and disease during the war, and Hans Frank was the man who orchestrated it all. The Butcher of Poland's reign eventually came to an end. I want to find out how, from someone who witnessed Frank's demise firsthand.
What is left in my memory is cowardice.
To complete my investigation into Hans Frank's story, I've returned to Germany to speak with his son once again.
Nicholas?
Hi, James.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me again.
Nicholas has a unique perspective on the rise and fall of Hans Frank's tyranny.
So he loved very much his office on the WWII, the castle of Krakow, where all the former Polish kings were residing. And he was happy about his 111 uniforms.
111.
And especially happy he was about his Mercedes, because his Mercedes has the same yellow light like Hitler's Mercedes had.
The post of Governor General over occupied Poland conferred more than just power. It gave Hans Frank status and wealth. Despite his legal training, during his 5 years ruling over the Polish people, Frank flouted his ability to break the law, thinking nothing of stealing precious works of art and giving jewels robbed from Jews to his wife and mistress.
Frank was spending an enormous sum of money to bring in fineries, riches. His wife was particularly drawn to furs. So they were buying luxuries, they were plundering wealth, to the point that Hans Frank's wife would even go shopping in the Krakow ghetto and try to get what she referred to as bargains from the very desperate population there.
He became the king of Poland. And he was so happy. And he never cared about all the victims in his country.
And when did you become aware of your father's crimes?
It started when they arrested my father at our village in Upper Bavaria on the 4th of May, 1945.
Yeah.
If you want a measure of what kind of man Hans Frank was, you only have to see what he does when the Soviets reach the gates of Krakow, you know, his kind of medieval castle. He flees.
As the Red Army closed in from the east, Hans Frank gathered his family, truckloads of stolen art, and hightailed it back to Germany. He hid out in the Bavarian Alps until he was arrested by the Americans and taken to Nuremberg to stand trial for war crimes. In the dock, he downplayed his knowledge of and role in the Holocaust.
Frank spun fables at his trial in an attempt to keep himself alive. It's laughable that Frank didn't have personal, direct knowledge of exactly what was happening, not only in the ghettos that he created and oversaw, but in the death camps, 4 of which were in the territory of occupied Poland, of which he was the Governor General.
Instead of owning up to his heinous crimes, Hans Frank tried to pass off his behavior as the work of an evil alter ego.
He told the psychiatrist in Nuremberg in his cell that he is sure that he himself is 2 persons. The one is a lawyer, the well-educated piano player, and the other is this ugly guy.
And what do you think?
He was just one person, one character, one mass murderer.
So as far as you're concerned, there's absolutely no way that your father could not have known about all the atrocities that were being committed by the Nazis in Poland?
Right. He knew everything. Also, my mother knew everything. They knew exactly what was going on every day, what was going on in the ghetto, in the concentration camp.
What's the hardest part about being the son of Hans Frank?
The hardest thing to think every day of him, to know nearly everything about his involvement in all those horrible crimes.
Hans Frank was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was hanged in October 1946.
So what's this here?
This is my biggest joy every day. This is the coat of my father. I can see it from our living room, sitting there and saying every day to my father, That's the only thing you have deserved, being a scapegoat at our little lake. And since then, he is standing here, and I'm very happy.
Why does it make you happy?
It shows for me that what is left of him, in my memory, his crimes, and even more, his cowardice. And when I look at him, I always accuse him, why have you done all of this? So what is really left from him is this coat, which he loved very much, and in which he also distributed so much fear to all the others who saw it. And now he's standing here, and only the birds have to be afraid of him.
Now that I know Hans Frank's central role in the brutal and lengthy occupation of Poland, it's time to figure out where he stacks up in Hitler's hierarchy.
You can slaughter them, lock them up, kill them, eradicate them, it doesn't matter. They're not human beings.
My visits to Poland and Germany have helped me understand Hans Frank's role in the Third Reich. Now it's time for us to decide where this Nazi lands in the hierarchy of evil. Using our unique system of playing cards, I want to determine where Hans Frank ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
The experience which had the biggest impact on me was meeting Hans Frank's son, Nicholas. I was amazed by Nicholas' bravery because I could not imagine publicly eviscerating my own father. But in his case, he feels people need to understand his father's crime.
In a very public, unvarnished, and raw way, Nicholas Frank is modeling what he thinks German society should do in general to grapple with the familial and the national legacy of the Nazi era. He has a message for subsequent generations and particularly for contemporary Germans. And that message isn't one of guilt or shame, it's responsibility.
For Nicholas, disseminating his father's story is vital to confronting Germany's past and preventing the reoccurrence of the heinous crimes committed across Poland during the Second World War.
Why was the Nazi occupation of Poland so brutal?
The Nazis regarded Poland as their own backyard. It was their territory to do with exactly how they liked, and the people they lived there, they didn't really regard as people. They regarded them as being subhuman. Now, if you start, regarding another human being as being no better than a sheep or a pig or a cattle, then it's much easier to do with them exactly what you like. So you can slaughter them, lock them up, kill them, eradicate them. It doesn't matter. They're not human beings.
I agree. Hans Frank's goals in Poland were to exterminate the Jews as quickly as possible and to enslave and deplace the ethnic Polish population.
If you see these individuals as subhuman, then to some extent you don't even interpret the behaviors that you're committing against them as immoral. It's a way to get around your own morality.
A key player in the Führer's master plan for the East, Hans Frank warped the law to encourage persecution, enslavement, starvation, and genocide.
You are all united in the fact that he was a central figure in the Nazi regime. But why do the majority of people know nothing about him?
I think part of the problem is that very few people in Western Europe and in North America actually study and look at the experience of Eastern Europe and Poland in particular. I think that's a great shame, and I think that Frank is someone who we need to know a lot more about.
The creation of the ghettos, the systematic starvation of the Polish people, and the state-sanctioned mass murder of the Jews were all overseen in the territory Hans Frank ruled. These atrocities place him well inside Hitler's circle of evil.
What I'd like to do now is to come to some sort of conclusion as to where you think Hans Frank should rank in the Nazi hierarchy of evil. Anthony, you go first.
Hans Frank, as a lawyer, played a large role in popularizing the Nazi Party, but he wasn't the only lawyer involved with doing that. As Governor General of occupied Poland, he was certainly central to the atrocities committed there, but he wasn't central to the leadership of the Reich. At the same time, we have to take into account the sheer brutality, the sheer suffering of his reign. I say he's number 20.
Matt?
On the one hand, I agree, he's just a lawyer. On the other hand, 3 million Jews and countless Poles died in Poland under his reign. I think he's more significant. I'm going to put him around 12.
He destroyed millions of people. He ruled over a vast segment of the Third Reich with the utmost barbarity. For me, he's got to be in the top 10. I'm going to give him an 8.
So the three of you have different views there in where you think he should rank. For me, it's quite simple. His fingerprints are on some of the worst Nazi atrocities. He has the blood of millions on his hands. I therefore rank him at number 10. He is the Queen of Hearts. Though he was well trained to know right from wrong, Hans Frank was nothing more than a vicious thug and a remorseless thief. For the genocide of Poland's Jews and the untold suffering of millions of non-Jewish Poles, Hans Frank makes it into the top 10 of Hitler's most wanted. Wilhelm Canaris, Hitler's master spy.
Canaris was the one who organized intelligence.
His covert operations caused chaos and destruction.
Canaris was working entirely in the service of the Nazi regime
and set the stage for World War II.
This was a spy chief who had to be reckoned with.
But all was not what it seemed.
He did provide information to the British.
He was directly involved to help Jews to leave Germany.
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis.
This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Wilhelm Canaris. This is a guy that most people probably have never heard of. He doesn't have any of the notoriety as people like Himmler, Goering, or Goebbels has. So I think it's important to start by saying, who is this guy and why is he important? Anthony, do you want to start off?
Canaris was a spy. He operated in the shadows to some extent, and in terms of his career and his ideology and his actions, he's an opaque figure.
I'd like to pick up on that. I think that too often with the Third Reich, these characters can be painted in black and white. And here we've got a figure who's got so many shades of grey. There's so much ambivalence here. And actually, for historians, it becomes a really interesting figure to look at.
So what muddies the water with Canaris?
We know that Canaris was opposed to aspects of the German war effort, and we know that he acted to undermine Hitler and Nazi Germany.
For me, he becomes a particularly interesting figure because he's been so good at keeping secrets about himself under wraps. It seems that nobody on either side knows exactly what his motives are. Historians aren't able to understand his goals. Psychologically speaking, that actually itself says something to me about the type of person he likely was.
I think he raises really big questions about how we would all behave in wartime. He's obviously got a really plum job, and he wants to keep it. Yet at the same time, some of what he sees, he finds morally repugnant. There's so many ways of interpreting Canaris' career and his actions. And so therefore, I think we really need to drill down very deeply.
I'm starting my investigation at the German Spy Museum in Berlin. I want to find out as much as I can about Canaris' tenure as Hitler's spy master, both before and during the Second World War.
Spying is famously called the second oldest profession in the world.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Florian Szymakowski is a scientific associate here.
So where are you taking me to?
We're now going to the Second World War section. That's where people like Canaris were working.
Canaris is the head of the Abwehr. That is the German military intelligence unit. And he's the boss. It's his job to gather military intelligence. The Abwehr has its tentacles in lots of parts of the military all over the Third Reich. It's a really big player.
What are we looking at first?
We're going to have a look at the spy radio set, especially constructed for agents of the Abwehr operating abroad.
Wow, so that's an actual Abwehr radio.
Yeah, and as you can easily see, it has been in use.
Spying is all about getting your intel back to home base. That made this a vital tool of the trade.
The Abwehr only produced like 500 pieces of this radio.
So it's very rare then?
It's quite rare, actually. It's built like a tank, so it's really hard to destroy. They used to throw radio sets like this down from planes with parachutes. We've got a parachute just above us, actually.
Okay.
Because it was complicated to smuggle the radio sets inside.
So the agents would have already infiltrated the country, and then they would wait for the radio to come after they'd arrived?
Most of the time. As you can see, the writings are in English to disguise where the radio was actually coming from. So when an agent gets caught with the radio, they don't follow it back to Germany. You see the Morse button down here.
Canaris and the Germans wanted to get hold of as many secrets as possible. They wanted military secrets, they wanted to get hold of technological secrets. Countries have been doing this to each other for centuries, millennia.
Radios like that, where were they being used?
They have been used by German agents working in France, Great Britain, or even in the eastern countries to spy on people and to send their messages home.
The other half of Canaris' job was to prevent enemy spies from gathering German secrets.
I understand that one of the jobs of the Abwehr, led by Admiral Canaris, was counterintelligence.
Canaris arranged the whole Abwehr systems, counterintelligence. That was one of their tasks, yes.
What sorts of periods of history?
Under Canaris, Abwehr counterintelligence agents were sent to infiltrate enemy spy units, to destroy evidence and spread misinformation. This was real-life cloak and dagger work that called for secret weapons from the pages of a spy novel.
So we opened it up that you can actually see the constructions inside. It was a one-bullet gun with just a small bullet, just 4 to 6 millimeters, but sometimes that could be the bullet that saves your life. So this wouldn't be maybe a gun to really do an assassination, but more kind of a self-defense. So if you get disguised as a spy, maybe that bullet gets you free.
So it was something to defend yourself if you were suddenly discovered?
Yeah.
Can I get my hands on
this?
Of course. Thank you very much. Wow. It's amazing. It's quite heavy for a pipe.
So if you want to fire it, you have to remove the mouthpiece and the security wire.
So this is like the equivalent of a safety catch.
Exactly. If you want to fire it, you have to hold it and then twist.
So you'd be given this already preloaded with a bullet.
Yeah.
And then if you needed to use it, you would then remove this safety catch.
Exactly.
And then you would aim it at your target and twist this, and it would fire.
Yeah.
Wow.
You can fire a single bullet that might save your life.
And I imagine if I needed to use this, I would have to be pretty close to the subject.
Yeah, because with really small bullet guns, the distance where it's really aiming correctly is like 10 to 15 meters, and after that, it gets complicated.
You'd have to be in quite a bit of trouble to use this thing. You only get one shot, you don't get a second chance. And I would not want to have to use this.
This was the world of espionage in the 1930s, with Wilhelm Canaris sitting like a spider at the heart of a vast intelligence web. But I want to know how he became head of the Abwehr, and if there are any clues in that story which might explain why he later turned against the Nazis.
Canaris had spent time in Latin America before World War I, and when World War I started, he was on a ship fighting the British in Latin America.
He served in the German Navy, first as an intelligence officer on a cruiser, and later as a submarine commander.
He was captured and interned on an island in Chile, and because he spoke Spanish, he managed to escape from internment and make his way back to Germany.
He served with distinction, but after the war, like so many German veterans, he returned to a homeland he no longer recognized. This is Michael Tramer. He's a photojournalist who can help me understand the nation's turbulent post-war period.
Germany was struggling with the leftovers from First World War. Times were tense, political violence was a very regular thing.
He's going to tell me about the events that transformed Wilhelm Canaris from a naval officer into a political firebrand.
Because I understand that World War I's coming to an end, Germany's defeat is in sight. All of a sudden, this new ideology that's erupted in Russia, communism, comes on the scene.
People were trying to set up a Soviet-style communist republic.
Germany's centuries-old power structure found itself facing a large-scale communist uprising. Canaris was an old-school monarchist. He hated the communists and feared they might seize power over Germany in its weakened state. So he helped organize a fighting force to combat them, part of what became known as the Freikorps.
The Freikorps were right-wing paramilitary groups formed by ex-soldiers who saw it as their mission to be counter-revolutionaries, to fight and stamp out radicalism, communism, and revolution in Germany. So you have right-wing militias populated with former soldiers doing battle in the streets with advocates of this declared Soviet-style republic.
They were performing basically a counter-revolution. The support of the Freikorps, buying right-wing ex-soldiers to fight communists, train them at the weapon, even though we are after World War I in Germany, nobody's supposed to bear a weapon at that time.
The Freikorps used deadly force to crush the communist uprising, but they weren't finished yet. In January 1919, Canaris and the Freikorps themselves tried and failed to overthrow Germany's government. This was a man who wasn't afraid to use violence to get what he wanted. And at that time, he was far from alone.
The Freikorps and the actions of the Freikorps, that laid the foundation for the rise of the Nazis and the rise of that far-right violence and political feelings.
Yeah, I would completely agree on that. And it set up the basis for the armed wings of the Nazis that were really, really important for taking the power and also ruling the streets and conducting attacks on those that do not fit into their idea.
In March 1933, Hitler and the Nazis completed their rise to power. A relentless campaign filled with anti-Semitic and anti-communist propaganda and deadly violence.
Canaris approved of Hitler. He approved of a strong leader to sweep away what he saw as the weakness of Weimar democracy.
Wilhelm Canaris became one of Hitler's devoted followers and would soon put his skills to work for the Third Reich.
Hidden radio transmitters and German spies. Hitler wanted to know every American secret.
This was a spy chief who had to be reckoned with.
I'm in Berlin on a mission to determine where Nazi spy master Wilhelm Canaris ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I'm about to investigate one of his early operations as head of the Abwehr, one that changed the course of European history.
During the period between World War I and World War II, Canaris was working on plans to secretly build weapons, things that Germany was forbidden to produce under the Treaty of Versailles. Canaris even supervised a secret plan to build U-boats in Japan.
In 1935, Canaris' many years of service were rewarded when he was made head of Germany's military intelligence organization, the Abwehr.
Heiko? James.
Oh, hi.
Very nice to meet you.
Yes, you too.
So I know you were an expert on Admiral Canaris.
Oh, yes. Canaris was one of the only German officers who was able to speak Spanish at that time.
This is Heiko Zur. He's a historian and author of a recent in-depth biography of Wilhelm Canaris.
What's this monument?
That's the International Brigades Memorial, and it's erected in 1968 and dedicated to the Germans who fought in the Spanish Civil War.
The Spanish Civil War saw the fascist forces under General Franco try to seize power in Spain in the mid to late 1930s. As a result, it kind of becomes a proxy war.
Combatants from all over the world poured into Spain to fight for their chosen side, and Germany was no exception.
So this would have been the Germans who were fighting on the side of the left-wing Republicans against the conservative right-wing forces of Franco.
Oh, yes.
But back in 1936, those men were considered outlaws here in Germany because the Nazis were clear about what side they supported.
Hitler wanted to help his fellow fascist, Franco, and he wanted to make sure that if anybody was going to win the Spanish Civil War, it was going to be a fascist and not a communist.
Obviously, Canaris was on Franco's side.
Yes, he was.
So how was Canaris involved in the Spanish Civil War?
Canaris was the one who organized intelligence, who organized military support from Germany and also from Italy to Franco.
Canaris was working entirely in the service of the Nazi regime when he coordinated the delivery of weapons to the nationalists under Franco. Canaris was also involved in spying on enemy shipping and working on the supply network.
The rest of the world started to watch the Spanish Civil War very, very closely when they realized that the Germans were waging it as well.
Canaris' work was instrumental in establishing Franco's brutal authoritarian regime that would hold Spain hostage for nearly 40 years. But even as the war in Spain raged, Canaris was hard at work planning for a much larger conflict. A global battle for supremacy between Germany and the United States.
The Duquesne spy ring was actually a brilliant and bold plan executed by Canaris, named after its chief operative, Fritz Duquesne. Now, this was a spy ring of about 30 agents peppered in key tactical locations throughout the eastern United States, in dockyards, in various sort of offices that were important. What it was there to do was to gather as much intelligence as they could about the United States, military intelligence, other sort of secrets, and send it all to Berlin.
Their mission was to identify the structures, industrial centers, and institutions that would be vital to any American war effort, and plan their sabotage. But a double agent recruited by the FBI infiltrated the ring.
The man walking up and down the street is Harry Sawyer, a naturalized German-American citizen.
And prevented any secrets from making it back to Canaris.
A spy trap was set. Sawyer was working for the FBI.
The Duquesne spy ring was essentially busted by the FBI.
Spies beware. Hiding their faces and under guard, 33 were seized. 19 pleaded guilty. 14 went on trial. The evidence was there, reams and reams of it, gathered by the ingenious men of the FBI. Hitler wanted to know every American secret, but dug up only grief for his blundering agents.
And it's one of the early uses of covert footage.
Walking into this trap is Colonel Fritz Duquesne. He is describing the gas operating principles of the M1 rifle, a secret which might have made a difference in the lives of a lot of Americans had it reached Germany.
And so we can see the Duquesne spy ring going about their business.
Hotwood Kleist has brought the blueprints of the steamship America, showing the plans of a secret gun emplacements.
Ultimately, it was a failure for Canaris, but it shows how bold he was, and it shows that this was a spy chief who had to be reckoned with.
And the stakes in this espionage game were about to get much higher.
In 1939, the Abwehr, which was led by Canaris, was creating a situation that could be used as a pretense for Hitler to invade Poland and pretend he was doing it defensively. Canaris provided Polish uniforms, weapons, and ID cards to members of the SS, and these SS men used these Polish documents and uniforms to attack a German radio tower on the border with Poland.
Canaris' Abwehr is partly responsible for this dummy attack. The Germans say that this supposed Polish raid was an act of Polish aggression against Germany and gives Germany the reason to go to war against Poland.
The ruse worked. The people of Germany gave Hitler their blessing to send their sons marching into yet another war. The invasion also began a surge in Nazi action against the Jews.
I know that some historians have suggested that Canaris was responsible for the idea of the Jews wearing a badge. Is that true?
I'm on a mission to find out where Nazi spy master Wilhelm Canaris ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I'm about to investigate one of the most disturbing chapters of his life story. On September 1st, 1941, the Nazis issued a decree ordering that all Jews over 6 years of age living in Germany and conquered territories like Poland must wear a yellow Star of David badge. It's an infamous moment in history.
Many say that Canaris was responsible for suggesting to Hitler that Jews be required to identify themselves by wearing a yellow star.
I've come to Berlin's Jewish Museum to find out more about the stars and Canaris' connection to them.
So, Christoph, where are you taking me?
I'm going to take you to a showcase where we present yellow stars, yellow badges, and we're going to take them out for you to look at them.
Oh, wonderful. So these are going to be original badges that Jews were made to wear during the war?
That were worn between 1941 and 45.
Oh, wow.
Christoph Kreutzmüller is the curator here.
Danke.
So these were badges that were actually worn by Jews during the Second World War?
Yeah, by a certain family living in Berlin. Georg Markus, his mother, and Erich Markus, and the brother. And they actually had to buy them for 10 pfennigs.
So you actually had to buy them? You were being forced to wear them, but you had to physically buy them?
Yeah.
Wow.
Nazi policies towards the Jews were intended not only to strip them of their rights, but also of their identity. They were all required to put the same yellow star on their chest. This removal of an individual's identity, it has a profound effect on your psyche. It likely influenced their ability to fight back, their resolve to fight as well.
I find there's an incredible irony with these badges that the Nazis claimed that they could identify Jews just on the street, presenting them as a separate racial group. Yet, when it came to it, they actually had to physically mark them themselves to identify them as a segregated part of society.
Still said all the time, oh, yeah, we can recognize them. And then found, no, of course you can't.
No. So they needed these badges?
Yeah.
And the yellow badges were a prelude to the deportations?
Yeah, and a tool.
Wow.
It's sickening to think that Jews had to pay for what was essentially their ticket to a concentration camp. But my visit has left me wondering, did Wilhelm Canaris, a career spy, really create the infamous badge? I've caught up once again with Canaris biographer Heiko Suhr to get his take on the claim.
I know that some historians have suggested that Canaris was responsible for the idea of the Jews wearing a badge. Is that true?
No, it's not true.
It's not true?
It's told in German books and in British books for about 50 years now, and it's repeated constantly. But it's not a German invention. It's a very long and old tradition in Europe to mark Jews with badges. It's a tradition from the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages.
Forcing Jews to wear a yellow Jewish star is something that has historical precedent in medieval Europe. But there weren't any examples of Jews being forced to wear a yellow Jewish star until the Nazis revived the practice.
Someone in the party had clearly done their history homework to revive the Jewish badge. The question is, who?
In 1941, Goebbels himself had the idea to introduce the Jewish star for the Jews in Germany.
Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's infamous minister of propaganda. He was perhaps the Führer's most fanatical follower and a virulent anti-Semite. For years, Goebbels had been pushing Hitler to approve a mandatory ID mark for Germany's Jews.
Goebbels asked his right-hand man, Leopold Gutterer, to organize some kind of conference with almost all important institutions in Germany.
Leopold Gutterer was Goebbels' subordinate and a loyal party member since 1925.
And they discussed the question if it's possible to introduce a Jewish star. And Leopold Gutterer directed the way of the discussion.
According to Heiko, Gutterer suggested the centuries-old badge be revived to identify Jews living in the Reich.
He was the one who pushed Goebbels, and then Goebbels pushed Hitler to introduce the Jewish star.
Okay.
Leopold Gutterer survived the conflict, was sentenced to hard labor for his war crimes, and died in 1996. The yellow badge went on to become perhaps the most infamous symbol of oppression of all time.
So where did this story that Canaris was responsible for suggesting the Jewish badge come from?
In 1949, Gutterer told it on court that Canaris was the one who pushed Hitler to introduce that badge, the Jewish star.
So he actually successfully managed to pin the blame on Canaris?
Yes, very successfully. One of the newest biographies on Canaris, written in 2006, repeated that story again. But the evidence is clear that Canaris is not the one who introduced the Jewish star.
So he had nothing to do with that?
No, nothing.
The implication is enormous. Gutterer would have known that by shifting blame to the Abwehr chief, he was painting him as an unspeakable villain for all history. But why Canaris?
Canaris engaged in numerous forms of resistance.
He's going against one of the major tenets of Nazi policy, which is to exterminate Jews.
I'm in Berlin on a mission to determine where Nazi spy chief Wilhelm Canaris ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've seen how a fellow Nazi falsely identified him as the creator of the infamous Yellow Star badge. But why Canaris? The answer may be found here, at Berlin's Resistance Museum.
This building was established in the year between 1911 and 1914.
Professor Johannes Tuchel is the museum's director.
And this wonderful space was a place where the residence of the War Ministry at the time was. In the Second World War, it was here the head of the reserve army and part of the command of the army.
According to Johannes, in the late 1930s, as Hitler steered Germany towards a new war in Europe, Canaris feared for the nation's future.
You can place Canaris as a very well-informed man. People described him as a dark personality, as a man who was very skeptical about the chances of the war. Will Germany win the war?
Canaris wasn't alone. He was one of a number of high-ranking Nazis who had deep misgivings about Hitler's increasingly aggressive posture in Europe. The situation came to a head in 1938, when he threatened to invade Czechoslovakia.
Canaris was in contact with people who were involved in the coup d'etat preparations, also in 1938.
A clandestine group led by Canaris' Abwehr subordinate, General Hans Oster, planned to kill Hitler and seize power to prevent the invasion from happening, a plot that became known as the Oster Conspiracy. But before they could move, Hitler struck the infamous Munich Agreement with Britain and France that allowed him to begin annexing Czechoslovakia without firing a shot. The coup plans were quietly shelved, and Canaris continued to lead the Abwehr as though nothing happened.
In order to be a good spy, you need to be able to be different people in different situations. You need to be pretty comfortable lying. You need to be able to hold multiple personas and remember those personas and when you were one and when you were the other. This is something that most people have a very hard time with and would find extremely stressful.
Canaris was, once again, the head of the German intelligence service. That is the complicated picture I can paint you about Canaris and the German resistance movement.
Canaris opposed Hitler's drive to war for strategic reasons. He didn't think Germany was prepared to win a war. This opposition didn't derive from moral qualms. It was more about strategy.
But that view would change just weeks into the fighting.
Shortly after the war began, Canaris visited German soldiers in Poland, and he saw what was happening there on the ground. He saw the murder of Jews and other civilians, and this action really showed him what this war was going to be like.
In the city of Bedzin, Canaris was confronted with the image of German soldiers forcing 200 Jews into a synagogue and then setting it on fire. The experience shook him to his core.
He was deeply depressed about the war crimes, and he was very skeptical for the future of Germany.
The incident drove Canaris to step up his efforts to undermine Hitler's plans.
Canaris engaged in numerous forms of resistance, ranging from sort of micro-resistance to networking to covering up the activities of people engaged in resistance plots.
We do know that he did provide information to the other side, to the British. But it was very unclear as to whether the British, were ever going to act upon what he told them, because, of course, they could have thought that Canaris was sending false information.
During the war years, Wilhelm Canaris led a bizarre double life. On one hand, he was still hatching deadly schemes against the Allies.
Operation Pistorius was an Abwehr plan to recruit Germans who had lived in the United States, smuggle them back into the United States by U-boat, and have them commit acts of sabotage, blowing things up. The plan didn't work. The agents that the Abwehr attempted to smuggle into the United States were caught and put on trial.
At the same time, Canaris had his hands in a radically different kind of plot.
He was directly involved in actions to help Jews to leave Germany in 1942 and 1943.
In the summer of 1942, Canaris helped cover up a plan by 2 other Abwehr officers to rescue 14 Jews from Berlin. The Gestapo was told that these Jews were necessary for a secret mission to Latin America. In reality, the Abwehr worked with Swiss officials to allow these Jews to be given entry to Switzerland and saved from certain deportation and death.
Canaris, a high-ranking Nazi surrounded by vicious anti-Semites, had done the unthinkable.
You've got the head of Nazi military intelligence actively saving Jews from being deported to their deaths. Now, we've got to put this into the reckoning when we come to assess Canaris, because he's going against one of the major tenets of Nazi policy, which is to exterminate Jews.
Why was Canaris helping Jews, the prime target of Nazi hate? I'm sure the Poland atrocities were a major factor, but there may have been another.
Prominent figures from the Third Reich know that Canaris' daughter was disabled.
That's terrifying.
I'm in Berlin on a mission to find out where Nazi spy master Wilhelm Canaris ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've just learned that in 1942, he began helping Jews escape from the Third Reich. I want to know why, so I've joined Heiko Zur in Berlin's Zellendorf neighborhood to get his view on this extraordinary turn of events.
So this is the neighborhood that Canaris was living in when he was head of the Abwehr?
Yes.
And which one is his house?
This one.
All right, let's go and have a closer look.
Yes.
Among his neighbors here were the Jews he helped escape to Switzerland. Also nearby was the home of feared SS intelligence chief, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was an old colleague of Canaris, and notorious even among his fellow Nazis for being ruthless. Hitler himself once called Heydrich the man with the iron heart.
Canaris and Heydrich are not friends, but they had to meet socially, and the wives had to meet socially too. And it was very difficult for Canaris to deal with Heydrich. Canaris' daughter told me that her mother, so Canaris' wife, had to come to Miss Heydrich, and they drink tea together, and they know that Canaris' daughter was disabled. Heydrich's wife said, "We had to kill all disabled persons."
Oh my God, that must have been absolutely terrifying for Canaris and his wife to know that one of the most evil men in the Nazi regime is aware of the fact that they have a child that is disabled.
Yes.
And in the Nazis' eyes, and especially in the eyes of Reinhard Heydrich, and it sounds his wife as well, that she should have been killed.
Yes.
That's terrifying.
Canaris was well aware of what the Nazi regime's policies were toward the disabled, and that injected a moral dimension into Canaris's growing suspicion about the regime.
That's an impressive-looking church.
Not far from the family home is another pillar of Canaris's life.
So this is where Canaris went to church?
Yes.
Was he a very religious man?
Yes, his faith was very important.
So did Canaris's faith play a role in his decision to go from supporting the Nazis to opposing them?
Yes, of course. Canaris did not make any decision before he think, and religion is one part of that process.
Faith, family, and the slaughter in Poland prompted Canaris to change his ways. But even as he did, rumors of his subversive activities spread, and in early 1944, SS chief Heinrich Himmler convinced Hitler to dissolve the Abwehr. Canaris was no longer a spy. A few months later, a group of Nazi officers famously tried to assassinate Hitler with a bomb, but failed. Canaris was implicated in the plot.
He actually couldn't have participated in the attempted assassination, but This attempted assassination was a good excuse for Hitler to get rid of somebody who he'd come to see as a thorn in his side. So Canaris was arrested.
Wilhelm Canaris was found guilty of treason and executed at Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9th, 1945.
Seems to me that he was very brave to do what he did, trying to resist and also save lives. Do you see him as a heroic figure?
In my opinion, no officer from the Third Reich can be called a hero. What is the difference between Oskar Schindler and Canaris? Schindler risked his life. Canaris, not really. He had a powerful position within the Nazi state. So Canaris risked not his life, but he used the power he had from his position.
It's a convincing argument. But before I make my final judgment of Canaris, I want to find out what life was like for everyday resistors living under Nazi rule. I've come to the University of Munich. During the Third Reich, it was home to a student resistance group known as the White Rose.
The White Rose opposed Nazism and attempted to resist mostly through intellectual means, mainly distributing pamphlets. They didn't engage in armed resistance, but they did try to spread ideas that were opposed to the regime.
This is a stunning university.
Yes, it's 150 years old. And you must know...
Hildegard Kronewitter is a former politician and an authority on citizen resistance during the Nazi regime.
The siblings, Hans and Sophie Scholl, put the pamphlets beside the doors here, and then they went up to the second. The leaflets were thrown down.
So they threw leaflets down from up there, and they would have landed on the floor of the atrium.
Here, yes.
Somebody sympathetic to the regime saw the pamphlets they were distributing and reported them, and they were both executed because of the pamphlets they were distributing.
During the prosecution, the siblings say there are only a few.
All right, so they protected maybe a larger group of people by just focusing on themselves.
Yes.
And that obviously destroyed the group.
Yes, yes.
I suppose it's easy for us today to say, you know, why didn't more people resist the Nazis? But as you very clearly pointed out there, that dictatorships are extremely hard to resist against.
Yes. There are really 7 persons who had to pay with their life for the freedom word. And this is the memorial here. It's really touching for us because there is no order that this memorial should always have white roses. There are people who bring roses with them.
Really? So does that give you hope?
Of course, because this is a sign that the people appreciate the persons who had been murdered by the Nazis, and they admire them. And I think if a person admire other persons, this person will learn from this.
I still can't believe they were just students trying to express free speech. And all they were doing was distributing pamphlets, and they lost their lives for it. It's unbelievable. But it really shows how incredibly brave they were to resist the Nazis.
Do Canaris' acts of resistance compare at all to the selfless heroics of the White Rose? It's now time to find out where the Nazi spy master ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
He was complicit with the regime. He didn't have to do the job he did.
Did he do as much as a committed resistor in his position could do?
My journey has given me new insight into Wilhelm Canaris' many plots to destabilize the world, setting the stage for the Second World War. It's also revealed his remorse and attempts to make at least some amends. Now it's time for us to decide where he should sit in the hierarchy of Hitler's Most Wanted.
Canaris' story is definitely one with many twists, and it's quite hard for me to figure out where we should start with this, but I think we do need to start with the bad things that he did. Anthony?
Well, he was drawn to Hitler. He was drawn to somebody who he thought embodied strong leadership and even dictatorial leadership. The relationship among Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco in Spain is a key relationship. And Canaris was directly involved in supplying arms from Germany and Italy to fascists in Spain.
Guy, how important was intelligence gathering during the Second World War and the role that Canaris played overall as effectively Hitler's spy master?
I don't think it's as important as your kind of thriller writer would like. I think that it's an exciting and fascinating part of war, but I don't think that the actions of Canaris and other spy chiefs fundamentally altered the course of the war. I think we can go in hard on him because of the fact that he was complicit with the regime. He didn't have to do the job he did. No one was going to execute him if he didn't do the job.
One thing to consider is the fact that he is, in fact, a trained spy. He was very comfortable with lying and being able to put forth whatever face was necessary for the situation. And yet he was, in fact, against some of the worst actions of the regime and aligned with the resistance to some extent.
That's right. He was completely repulsed by what was happening to Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland, by mass shootings and by the early stages of genocide.
But how effective was his resistance against Hitler?
If you're one of the Jews that he was able to save, you'd say very effective. And he found some creative ways to save Jews given the powers that were at his disposal. Did he take a lot of risk to save Jews? Did he act in ways that might have brought unwanted attention to himself? Did he do as much as a committed resistor in his position could do? Probably not.
Let's face facts. Yad Vashem is not going to make him the righteous among nations for helping to save Jews during the war. But certainly there is enough sense of whiteness in all these shades of grey with Canaris to not call him a hero as such, but certainly not to write him off as a complete villain.
These shades of grey make Canaris an extraordinarily difficult personality to pin down. He was instrumental in starting a war that rained misery and death down upon millions, but it's impossible to ignore his clandestine resistance campaign.
What I'd like to do now is come to some sort of conclusion where you think he should rank in the hierarchy of evil. What I'm most interested by is, based on our conversation, does he even deserve to be in this pack of cards? Guy, what are your thoughts?
Personally, I think no, he doesn't. Why? I happen to think that there are 52 worse Nazis in the Third Reich who are deserving of a place on this deck. So therefore, I'm not going to put him on this at all.
I tend to agree with Guy, but there's enough doubt in my mind to have me rank him particularly low on the deck at least. I'm going to put him at 45.
Anthony?
I disagree with you, Guy. The success of the nationalists in Spain was a central goal of the Nazi state, and Canaris was integral to that success. The Franco regime outlasted the Nazi regime by decades. Because of that, I think he does belong in this ranking, and I rank him number 52.
This has definitely been the hardest one for me to assess. I understand that he was involved in resisting Hitler. I understand that as being maybe a redemptive quality about him. However, he still was part of the Nazi regime. There are still things that he did that have to be taken into account. So I disagree. I don't think he should be left out of the pack of cards entirely. I also disagree. I think 45 is a little high because I think there definitely are a number of Nazis that are ahead of him. So I have to agree with Anthony here. I think he is number 52. He's therefore the two of clubs.
Wilhelm Canaris became enthralled with Hitler and masterminded a deadly intelligence network that destabilized Europe. But during the war, he turned against the Nazis and actually helped Jews escape to safety. For that, he ranks 52nd in Hitler's Most Wanted. Benito Mussolini, a brutal dictator whose violent path to power set the template for the rise of Nazi Germany.
For Hitler, Mussolini was very much an idol.
He helped forge an evil alliance that unleashed death and destruction across Europe and betrayed his own people.
There was a kind of blood coming like a rain, and they started to shoot everywhere.
How did Benito Mussolini go from fascist radical to partner in global terror?
Most people from my generation don't understand how over 70 years ago, a small group of Nazis could start a war that killed 60 million people. I want to find out, and to help me, I'm going to use playing cards. Today, they're used by both the military and law enforcement to help identify their targets. But nobody has ever put together a pack of cards for the most notorious group of killers in history. Working with experts, I want to know where each of these Nazis rank in the hierarchy of evil. My name is James Ellis.
This is Hitler's Most Wanted. Hitler was in Mussolini's shadow for effectively 11 years. What did he learn from Mussolini in terms of a blueprint for taking power?
Hitler would have come to power without Mussolini. But in important ways, Mussolini was the model for what fascism was and for how a movement like Hitler's could take power. And he was a fascist dictator. He was a serious, brutal dictator who committed many atrocities in his own right.
Yes, I think this is really important because even though he wasn't a Nazi, he was a fascist.
Guy, why would two dictators want to work together and effectively interact almost as friends?
The answer is simple. It's realpolitik. They needed each other in order to build up what became the Axis. They needed to provide a kind of bulwark against what they saw as these decaying nations, the democracies.
When two alpha males come together, even in a partnership, inevitably there's going to be some conflict. So a particularly interesting question is, who was actually in charge?
Given that he wasn't a Nazi, how do we evaluate his importance to this period of history?
For that, you've got to go to Italy.
I'm starting my journey in Predappio, the small village in central Italy where Benito Mussolini was born. This is Mussolini's childhood home. Since his death more than 70 years ago, this building has become a sort of monument to his legacy. Ciao. Hello. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno, buongiorno.
I couldn't help but notice you doing the fascist salute back there.
Lui parla inglese.
Explain. Noi siamo fascisti tutti e tre, sì. Yeah.
What do you think of Mussolini?
Pensiamo bene, tutto il bene possibile.
Why?
Perché? Perché?
Perché? E perché voi non gli volete bene? Ditemelo voi il perché.
He said, why you don't love Mussolini? Why?
Because he was a fascist dictator and he dragged this country into the Second World War.
Eravamo costretti in un certo senso.
Right, so you think that he was forced into his alliance with Hitler?
No, il rapporto di forza si è invertito. Cioè prima erano pari, poi Hitler ha detto sono io che comando. Se non ti sta bene, rimpiangerai le sorti della Polonia. Cioè.
I'm struggling to come to terms with what just happened. We're outside the house that Mussolini was born in, and a couple of guys openly did the fascist salute. And then, after speaking to them more about it, they then expressed admiration for Mussolini. Instead of renouncing him, Mussolini's hometown has become a sort of shrine to his memory.
People tend to think about memory as if it's a video camera, where there's an accurate play-by-play representation of all past events. But this isn't the way that memory works. People have a tendency to shift their memories to adapt to the narrative that they would like to tell.
Some people here are even cashing in on a shifted memory of Mussolini. Do you get a lot of people who come in and buy this type of stuff? Yeah, you do. Are they people who are just tourists in the area, or are they supporters of Mussolini? So I can't ask her any questions? No. Better. Got a few items. First of all, a T-shirt with Mussolini's face on it. Next, I got some Mussolini head-shaped pasta. But then finally, I managed to buy this there. It's a swastika armband. A little part of me can understand why that store would exist, but it is really disturbing to see them selling Nazi paraphernalia in that store. It's a troubling situation. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to Italy at the end of the First World War. Italy ended the war as a victor, but the Treaty of Versailles didn't give Italy the territories it felt it deserved, leaving many Italians feeling betrayed and angry. Adding to the bitterness, the Italian economy was floundering, unemployment was high, and strikes were constant. Enter Benito Mussolini. A war veteran himself, Mussolini began attracting followers with his belief that brute force was the only way to reclaim Italy's deserved glory.
Mussolini regarded liberal democracy as degenerate, doomed to failure, and that needed to be replaced by an ideology based on action, where a strong leader could take charge and get the country going in the direction that he wanted it to go in.
In March 1919, Mussolini formed the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, a paramilitary group that embraced fascist ideology.
A fascist is someone who believes in the supremacy of the state, who believes that nationalism is far more important than the rights of the individual.
Mussolini's new group attracted many unemployed war veterans. He organized them into armed squads known as black shirts and set them loose on Rome.
The black shirts were engaging in street violence and in attacking property and newspapers of socialists and other political opponents.
Mussolini's black shirts swiftly grew in number to more than 150,000 strong. By 1921, the Italian king Victor Emmanuel III dissolved parliament amidst the growing violence and chaos. As part of the anti-socialist national blocs, Mussolini's Fasci of Combat won 35 seats in the next election, setting the stage for a change in leadership.
In 1922, Mussolini leads this famous march on Rome in an attempt to literally seize power. Forget doing it the democratic way, let's just march on Rome and let's get it done.
So when fascists descended on Rome, the king of Italy, in an attempt to maintain order and avoid declaring martial law, actually dismissed the government and asked Mussolini to form a new government, in effect allowing Mussolini to seize power for himself.
Now, there's someone watching this and seeing it as a kind of model way in which he too might seize power. And that, of course, is Adolf Hitler.
The idea that Mussolini had created a new Rome, had created something new out of a democratic order that Hitler also regarded as degenerate and decadent, deeply impressed Hitler.
Aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
When Hitler visited Rome in May of 1938, Mussolini welcomed him with an enormous spectacle.
So, Christian, you're taking me to the Roma Ostiense train station.
The Roma Ostiense train station is a really important monument in the history of the relationship of Mussolini and Hitler.
Right. Historian and author Christian Gerschel is an expert on the alliance between Mussolini and Hitler.
It is a huge monument.
Wow, it is, isn't it? Look at it.
The building was put up for Hitler's arrival in May 1938, when Hitler came on his only state visit to Italy. The idea was to show off the strength and power of fascist Italy to the Nazis, that fascism in Italy would be the strongest ally for Hitler and the Nazis.
Well, let's have a closer look at the building then.
Look at this.
Yes.
This mosaic is a very strong reference to the Roman Empire. This was a theme that ran throughout Hitler's visit in May 1938, and it left a profound impression on Hitler and the Nazis. The idea that fascist Italy would be as strong as ancient Rome made Hitler and the Nazis believe that fascist Italy would be and should be Germany's ally.
It's an alliance that makes a lot of sense when you look at the goals of Hitler and Mussolini as leaders and the goals of fascism and Nazism as movements. Mussolini needed Hitler as fascist Italy had become a bit isolated internationally. For Hitler, there weren't really obvious choices among European powers for a military alliance.
Let's go inside.
Let's have a look.
So what were Hitler's impressions of Mussolini when he came here?
Extremely positive, because for Hitler, Mussolini was very much an idol. Hitler believed that Mussolini, as the first fascist dictator in Europe, was someone who had reached power through a twofold strategy. One, to use political violence against political opponents, beating up, killing, murdering, torturing political opponents. The second part of the fascist strategy of power was the attempt to play by the rules of parliamentary politics.
So it was like Mussolini had created the playbook of how to come to power that used political violence when it's necessary, but you also play by the rules as well.
It was this fascist template for securing power that greatly inspired the Nazi rise to power, that facilitated the Nazi rise to power.
The alliance between Mussolini and Hitler would have devastating consequences the world over and change the face of Italy forever.
You have 9 columns, 9 being the number of letters in Mussolini's last name.
Wow, you can still see his name on it.
I'm on a mission to find out where Benito Mussolini ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil. I've come to Rome to learn about Mussolini's grand plans for Italy alongside author and historian Christian Gerschel.
So where are you taking me, Christian?
I'm taking you now to the so-called Palace of Roman Civilization. The building is one of the most famous architectural legacies of Italian fascism.
Wow, I mean, it's a very imposing building, but when I look at it, I sort of feel that I'm looking at a square version of the Colosseum.
This building was part of a grander scheme to build a new neighborhood in Rome called the EUR neighborhood, EUR being the Italian abbreviation for the World Exposition that was scheduled to be held in Italy, again to show off the strength and power of fascist Italy.
The closer you get to it, you really sort of feel the size of it, how imposing it is, and sort of plays into that idea of trying to make you as an individual feel insignificant.
What is striking about the architecture of this building is you have 9 columns, 9 being the number of letters in Mussolini's last name, and 6 columns, 6 being the number of letters in Mussolini's first name.
Wow, so they sort of subtly signed his name into this building.
It could well be an urban myth, but several commentators have pointed this out.
And what does the inscription at the top say?
A quotation from Mussolini that celebrates Italy, in this case, as a people of poets, of artists, of heroes. Not only a great military power, also a great artistic, cultural, intellectual power. The message of this palace is to reinforce the notion that fascist Italy stood in the footsteps of ancient Rome.
Both Mussolini and Hitler were hearkening back to either an historical or mythical past, a time of supposed greatness of civilization. For Hitler, you have a mythic Germanic past and the idea of an Aryan civilization that was superior to all others. For Mussolini, this is very clearly the Roman Empire.
Aligning himself with the glories of ancient Rome allowed Mussolini to fuel the cult of personality spreading across Italy.
Cult of personality occurs when a country uses mass media, propaganda, demonstrations, advertisements to try to create a godlike or almost superpower, omnipotent image of the leader.
I want to learn more about Mussolini's obsession with ancient Rome.
Whereabouts are you taking me?
I'm taking you here to what we now know today as the Olympic Stadium.
And the best person to ask is historian Richard Bowen.
To see a complex that was built in the 1930s. So you have an obelisk here.
Wow, you can still see his name on it.
Yes.
I find that really odd that his name is so openly displayed on this obelisk in front of this building today in Rome.
Yes, it is a little strange, but this is how it is, if you like, there. This is part of the history of the city, rightly or wrongly, and it's still on display today.
So what exactly is this site, and what did Mussolini intend it to be when it was being built?
So this was a site that was taken up by Mussolini and made into a huge sporting area to show off the importance of the regime, and also in some shape or form or another, the new architectural plans that Mussolini had for Rome, build these big wide boulevards and create these new sort of like architectural projects that in some shape or form or another evoke the past of ancient Rome, but are also at the same time modern in their own outlook as well.
So I notice here we have the fascist symbols on the ground.
We have a lot of the fascist rods over here. We have the M for Mussolini interlaced with the fascist rods over here. And then we also have a map of Rome. So we get bits and pieces of ancient Rome here, which the modern day Italy is going to evoke. We can see the fascist eagle over there. So a lot of the fascist symbols were dug up, if you like, there from the time of ancient Rome.
Even the actual fascist symbol itself
exactly.
is something from the ancient Roman period.
It literally means a bundle, so the idea of the fascism would be a unified kind of like guild of people working together.
What was Mussolini hoping to achieve with all this fascist symbolism?
Well, a greater sense of unity and the idea of a nation-state. You know, Mussolini inherited a nation that was still very much regional in its outlook. I would even argue that even today, parts of Italy still regional in its outlook rather than nationalistic. So one way he was able to try to sort of like create this idea of a nation-state was to use a lot of this ancient symbolism.
So he was using Italy's ancient past as a kind of unifying force.
Definitely, yes.
I find that incredible that thousands of people will come through here to watch a football game, to watch another major sporting event, and they're walking right over all of this fascist imagery that Mussolini placed here.
Mussolini's plans to create a new Roman Empire were wildly ambitious. And soon they would plunge his country into chaos.
The clock is set on the precise time of the first air raid over the city of Rome.
That's incredible.
In my quest to find out where Benito Mussolini ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil, I've come to explore Mussolini's villa in Rome.
So we're leaving the main floor and heading directly under the house?
Yes, we are reaching the basement of the house.
So this bunker was built for Mussolini?
Francesca Paino is a guide with the organization Rome Underground.
This is actually an air raid shelter that was arranged in 1941.
Oh, wow.
This room is actually under the dancing room of the main house.
Why did he have this bunker built?
Because Mussolini and his family, they were living here in Villa Torlonia in the main house called Casino Nobile.
This underground shelter was designed to allow Mussolini to continue his rule in Rome as Europe erupted in war. In September of 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland started World War II. Only months earlier, Hitler and Mussolini had signed the Pact of Steel, a mutual agreement to support each other in times of conflict.
The war has started. Now, who's meant to join in? According to the Pact of Steel, Mussolini. What does he do? Nothing.
Hitler was furious. But Mussolini had his reasons.
It's because his military is basically hopelessly undermanned. It doesn't have enough weaponry and material. He's realistic enough to know, clever enough to know, that even if he does declare war, there's not a lot he can do.
Less than a year into the war, however, Hitler's armies were sweeping across Europe, and Mussolini reconsidered his decision to abstain.
Of course, by May 1940, Hitler's doing incredibly well. He's overrunning the Low Countries, he's going into France, and Mussolini thinks, hang on, I want to be part of this action, I want to have a slice of the pie. So if I join Hitler, I can get all sorts of territories in southern France and who knows elsewhere.
L'ora delle decisioni irrevocabili.
It soon became clear, however, that Mussolini would not prove to be an effective ally to Hitler. Italian forces failed miserably in North and East Africa and Greece. Again and again, Hitler's armies were called out to help Mussolini's struggling forces.
So what else can you tell me about the shelter? I mean, what are some of the features? What's it equipped with?
First of all, the anti-gas doors.
Okay.
So here we have an anti-gas door, and they were usually in couples. So there is another anti-gas door on the other side, and they opened on the two sides. So this was the best way to prevent the gas enter into the room. And the second thing is the air filtration system, because the gas is the worst thing in these cases.
And then I see there's a desk here.
They are here because probably Mussolini worked while he was waiting here in the air raid shelter.
Right, so he could continue working, whatever he was doing up in the main house, he could bring down here and continue that. Did he ever use this particular bunker?
So this bunker was built in 1941, and the first air raid over Rome was in 1943. So we should say that he didn't use during the air raids, but he probably used when there were alarms that did not ended up with an air raid over the city of Rome.
So if there had been alarms, it would have been likely that he would have come down from the house and taken shelter in here in preparation in case Allied aircraft suddenly appeared over Rome and started dropping bombs. Is there a significance to the time that's set on that clock?
The clock is set on 11:13, which is the precise time of the first air raid over the city of Rome, on the 19th of July, 1943. So this is just to remember that time, because it was a very bad moment for the city of Rome.
As more and more Allied bombs fell on the capital, Mussolini struggled to maintain power.
Mussolini's having a far tougher time controlling his own country, his own territory, than Hitler does. What's the reason for that? Well, actually, Italy has always been a pretty fractured country. It hasn't really existed as a country for a very long time, and even today in Italy, there are vast differences between the north and the south. They almost regard themselves as separate nations. For Mussolini, trying to hold that all together while also trying to carry out wars in Africa and in the Balkans, it's an incredibly tough call for him.
By 1943, the Axis powers were losing control of the war.
The Allies are doing incredibly well in North Africa, the Italians and the Germans are retreating, and we're also going to get the landings by the Allies on Sicily.
The invasion of Sicily. 2,000 ships bringing great armies of battle-hardened British, Americans, and Canadians.
Suddenly, the Allies are now on Italian Axis soil. This is a major moment in the war.
As the Allies closed in, work on Mussolini's bunker continued deeper underground.
Where are you taking me now?
So now we are going into the proper bunker. It's a tunnel that was built in 1942.
Certainly a lot deeper underground.
Yeah, here we are about 6 meters under the floor of the house.
6 meters,
6 meters under.
underground.
Yeah. Wow. This bunker was made actually of this tunnel. So you can see that something is missing. The doors are missing. The air filtration system is missing in this bunker. And then these 2 rooms on 2 sides. We don't know what they were used for because this bunker is unfinished. It was never completed.
Mussolini's bomb shelter was never finished because by July of 1943, the Italian people saw only one way to extract Italy from the war and avoid escalating crisis.
In 1943, Mussolini is removed from power by the Italian king. There is still a check and a balance on his dictatorial powers. There isn't the same thing in Germany, and that's one of the reasons why Hitler, of course, will stay on right to his dying day. So Mussolini, in 43, after, basically 2 decades in power, the king says, right, we've had enough of you, the people have had enough of you, time you went.
Once again, Hitler had to come to Mussolini's rescue.
Even though Hitler essentially regards Mussolini as almost a sort of bit of a buffoon, he still feels a loyalty to his former fascist bedmate, if you like. Mussolini is incarcerated in this mountaintop hotel, and actually there's this very daring rescue mission carried out by the SS that actually rescues Mussolini and takes him off the mountainside in a tiny little aeroplane.
German pilots speed Mussolini to Hitler's secret headquarters. And a discarded Duce greets the man who gave him the kiss of death.
It's a great coup for the Germans to prove that they can actually snatch Mussolini from right under the Italians' noses. So it's a great coup for Hitler, and the world goes, wow. But actually, it's changed nothing.
It was rumored that Mussolini was dead, but these pictures show him as still much, too much alive.
Mussolini is then installed in the German-controlled north of Italy. He's now become a kind of puppet dictator. He's just another one of these kind of satellite fascist leaders with no real power of his own.
The rescue saved Mussolini, but plunged Italy into chaos. The king and military leaders fled south. The Germans marched in and took over Rome. Nazi oppression in Italy was brutal. On March 23rd, 1944, the Italian people struck back.
The Führer wanted for every German soldier killed 50 Italian to be killed. There was a tremendous 50.
My journey to discover where Benito Mussolini ranks in Hitler's hierarchy of evil has brought me to this narrow street in Rome to meet with Mino Carbone, an expert on the history of the Italian resistance. In September of 1943, the Nazis had begun an oppressive occupation of Rome.
So it was a very brutal Nazi occupation.
Brutal occupation. There was a curfew, the food was not possible, didn't find food. There was the black market. A piece of butter costed 10,000 more the regular price.
Wow.
So it was terrible. It was a situation which was horrible. The Nazi was terrible.
There were plenty of Italians who really didn't care for having German jackboots, you know, clacking their way down Italian and Roman streets.
On March 23rd, 1944, the Italians struck back.
So what happened here?
They want to give to the Roman people a kind of wake up call. Please, wake up, we can help the Allies, we can get rid of the Nazi. This group made of students, they were students. They decided to attack this group, which were made up of 156 soldiers, and they organized a bomb, which was terrible, was about 18 kilos of TNT. Imagine there were 156 soldiers marching. They were going up. As soon as it arrived into Palazzo Tittoni, there was the blast. One of the strongest ever. All the city Roma trembled. There was a kind of tremble everywhere. And the first lines were completely decapitated, were completely tremendous. There was a kind of blood coming like a rain. Yeah. And the back lines were normally safe. And they started to shoot everywhere because they thought there was a bomb coming from the top. Nobody understood that. You see the bullet splashes over there. Nobody understood where the bomb came up. And the 32 of them died immediately.
Of course, when Hitler finds out about this, he goes absolutely crazy. There's no other word for it.
And the Führer wanted for every German soldier killed 50 Italian to be killed. There was a tremendous 50.
For every one German,
for
50 Italians.
Eventually, Hitler's talked down from that simply because of the practicalities of the situation. The local Gestapo are ordered to go round Rome's prisons and round up anybody they can find to execute and carry out these reprisals, which are now going to be carried out at a ratio of 10 to 1. They go to prisons and they find lots of young men. Some are in prison for very, very minor offences. I mean, literally just kind of shoplifting and burglary. And they take them to the Ardeatine cave.
I've come to the Ardeatine caves on the outskirts of the city to learn the next part of the story.
Lieutenant Colonel, James. Very nice to meet you.
Lieutenant Colonel Francesco Sardone is the director of this memorial site.
I know this was the site of a brutal massacre. What exactly happened here?
Le vittime venivano scaricate nel piazzale 5 alla volta e con 5 SS vicino venivano portate in questo posto, fatte entrare nella grotta, praticamente fatte inginocchiare e ogni tedesco sparava al condannato che aveva vicino 2 colpi di pistola, uno dietro la testa e uno davanti la faccia, in modo che la morte era assicurata e veniva, una volta ucciso, lasciato sul posto. La situazione era che chi arrivava qui, il condannato che arrivava qui, trovava già 1 metro di cadaveri uno sopra l'altro e doveva montarci sopra, inginocchiarsi sui suoi compagni e trovare la morte in questo modo, in modo psicologico e molto duro.
How did people find out what happened here?
Per i tedeschi sostanzialmente era importante per loro non far ritrovare i corpi, quindi pensarono di far crollare con della dinamite tutta questa parte che vediamo. Erano di difficile ritrovamento successivo. Non presero in considerazione che qui intorno però in quei giorni c'erano molti pastori, c'erano anche dei frati di un convento vicino che sentirono tutte queste grida, tutti questi spari e tutto questo movimento, e quindi successivamente, quando poi il Comune di Roma e gli americani nel luglio del 1944 cercarono il posto dove potesse essere stato fatto questo eccidio, l'esercito americano si riuscì a trovare esattamente dove fu fatto questo eccidio.
How did people react?
Fu una cosa orrenda sapere il massacro che era successo e per il motivo per cui era successo. Il popolo italiano poi ha voluto in maniera molto forte, ma soprattutto i familiari delle vittime hanno voluto molto forte che in questo posto dove hanno ucciso appunto 335 persone costruissero una memoria di quello che era successo. Il popolo romano lo vedono come il simbolo della resistenza dell'epoca, un simbolo della richiesta di libertà dell'epoca.
The people did not have to wait long to be free. 3 months after the massacre, in June 1944, Allied forces entered the city.
With the Germans in headlong retreat, Yanks of the Fifth Army enter Rome in triumph.
The liberators were acclaimed with ecstatic fervor. Rome is the first great capital to be freed from the enemy.
By April of 1945, it was clear the Allies would win the war. Mussolini decided to flee.
Mussolini, with his mistress, Clara Petacci, wants to escape to Switzerland. He thinks that maybe he's going to find safe haven there. So when he's in a village called Dongo, near Lake Como, actually, he's captured by Italian fighters. This does not end well for Mussolini and Clara Petacci, because they are shot.
Dead in the streets of Milan lies the body of Benito Mussolini, first of the dictators and the first to go.
His body was then taken to Milan, along with Clara Petacci's, and it was hung upside down from a petrol station.
Two days after Mussolini died, Hitler committed suicide. The following week, Germany surrendered. The fascist alliance between Germany and Italy was finished. But Mussolini's story was not over yet.
Holy, this is very creepy.
To complete my journey to understand Mussolini's story, I've come back to Predappio, his hometown. This is Mussolini's family crypt, where Benito lies buried. Like many places in town, it's become a pilgrimage site. This place is considered so sacred, you're not allowed to speak out loud in here.
What's really curious is that Mussolini is venerated and commemorated in Italy in a way that Hitler simply is not in Germany. Why is this? Well, I don't think it's because Mussolini's legacy is beneficial in any way. I think it's because Italy has never really had to have the same soul-searching and acknowledgement of fascist excesses and brutality in the same way as Germany's had to.
The almost total buy-in in German society to Nazism and the resulting unconditional surrender and occupation forced a reckoning with what had happened and what people were complicit in. That reckoning didn't happen in Italy.
Holy, this is very creepy.
Not everyone here is on Team Mussolini. Some are working hard to change the way he is remembered.
You won this award for your anti-fascist work.
Yes.
Including Giorgio Frassonetti, the mayor.
È una piccola targa che è molto importante perché rappresenta la contraddizione di Predappio. Qui è la stanza dove viveva Mussolini, il capo del fascismo, e oggi chi l'abita è il sindaco di Predappio che ha ricevuto un premio dal governo austriaco come antifascista dell'anno nel 2016. Noi siamo contro il fascismo, noi siamo contro il totalitarismo, noi non vogliamo che accada più. Questo messaggio, se parte dalla stanza dove dormiva, viveva il giovane Mussolini, ha ancora più forza e valore.
So I noticed you have the fascist emblem on your desk. How do you feel about that?
Io non ho paura e anzi non mi interessa, nel senso che è storia. Cioè non è un qualcosa che riguarda il futuro, è una cosa che riguarda il passato, un passato assolutamente difficile, scomodo, complicato da gestire, ma è qualcosa che è passato. La sala dell'assemblea più importante di Predappio, che è la sala del Consiglio Comunale. Come vedi, sono state grattate dai simboli del fascismo. Cioè, questa sedia racconta due storie. La prima storia è chi ci ha messo il fascio littorio, il simbolo del fascismo. La seconda storia è quella che l'ha tolta.
Why is it so important to understand what happened here in this place?
Noi non possiamo permettere che possano tornare i totalitarismi, i fascismi, i nazionalismi.
My journey through Italy has really opened my eyes to Mussolini's legacy. Now it's time to decide where he ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
Frankly, I find it highly disturbing that Mussolini is still venerated in Italy today.
My mission to Italy has given me new insight into the rise of the fascist alliance between Mussolini and Hitler. It's also revealed how Mussolini enthusiastically joined Hitler in war and unleashed massive destruction across Europe. Now, using our unique system of playing cards, I want to know where Benito Mussolini ranks in Hitler's Most Wanted.
The place that I went to that had the biggest impact on me was Predappio, which is Mussolini's hometown. There is what I can only describe as a fascist tourism trade going on there. Anthony, why is Mussolini revered by many Italians today?
Partly has to do with the persistent myth of the good Italian fascist and the bad Nazi, the myth that Mussolini did some good things and that the bad things he did, he was forced to do by Hitler. There are people in Italy who will still point to things like Mussolini supposedly breaking the hold of mafia in certain territories, or the famous line of making the trains run on time. And in this fog of nostalgia, that tends to override the actual realities of brutal fascist dictatorship.
I agree with you, Anthony. Frankly, I find it highly disturbing that Mussolini is still venerated in Italy today. I think it also tells us a lot about the fragmentary nature of Italian politics and indeed Italian society. You may think of Italy being this sort of, solid boot-shaped country, but in fact, the North and the South are almost completely separate countries. And I think what Mussolini represents to a lot of Italians is kind of coming together of this very troubling nation. He did seize it by the scruff of the neck, held it together for quite a long time.
To add to that, it's interesting that Mussolini's remains are in a tomb in an elaborate family crypt, yet Hitler's remains have been unceremoniously disposed of.
Mussolini might have actually benefited from being in Hitler's shadow to some extent. The shadow of Hitler's atrocities compared to the terrible things that Hitler did, Mussolini might appear to be the lesser evil. And I wonder if Hitler didn't exist, if Mussolini would not be quite as revered as he is today.
I think you're exactly right. Adherents of the cult of Mussolini can hide behind Hitler's atrocities.
He elevated fascism to great heights in Europe through a brutal and murderous regime. All that, combined with his alliance with Hitler, places Mussolini well inside Hitler's circle of evil.
What I'd like to do now is come to a conclusion as to where we think Mussolini ranks in the Nazi hierarchy of evil.
and the fact that he wasn't a Nazi, whether he deserves to be in here at all. Guy, what are your thoughts?
Well, you're right, of course. He's not officially a Nazi, so therefore he shouldn't necessarily be in the deck. But, let's face facts. He is a major fascist leader. He committed enormous atrocities, murdered political opponents who used poison gas, slaughtered entire villages in order to promote a twisted racial ideology. That's got to be very high. I'm going to put him at 5.
Anthony?
Guy, I agree with your reasoning, but not your conclusion. Mussolini is absolutely central to the history of fascism. But in terms of his influence on the Nazi regime, well, Hitler would have come to power without Mussolini. The Holocaust would have happened without Mussolini. Hitler did launch World War II without Mussolini. And yet Mussolini provided a model for fascist seizure of power, and the International Fascist Alliance is incredibly important. I rank him number 29.
Matt?
I largely agree with Anthony. I think if we were rating him on a hierarchy of overall evil, I'd rank him very high, possibly as high as Guy. But in terms of his ranking in Hitler's hierarchy of evil, he just doesn't seem as central a figure to the regime. I'm going to put him very similar. I'm going to put him number 30.
Interesting. So both of you are pretty much on the same page there, but Guy, you're very different in your opinion. I personally think he has to be remembered for what he was, a brutal fascist dictator and one of Hitler's principal enablers. Based on that, I'm going to say he stands at number 15. He is the Jack of Diamonds. I see Benito Mussolini as someone who was a clear role model and a big inspiration for Hitler. He went into an alliance with Hitler that dragged his country into the Second World War and brought suffering to the Italian people. Even though he was not a Nazi, he deserves a place in Hitler's Most Wanted.